What if the greatest engineering project in human history was never meant to be found? Not hidden exactly, not buried beneath sand or lost to fire, but rather overlooked, ignored, dismissed as the whim of nature, the accident of geology, the slow carving of wind and water across millennia. What if we have been walking past evidence of impossible ambition for generations, our eyes trained to see only what we expect to see, our minds conditioned to accept the boundaries of what ancient hands were supposedly capable of achieving? There is a place where the earth remembers, where the ground itself holds the shape of intention, circular and vast, carved with such precision that even erosion seems reluctant to erase its form. Ring-shaped basins, some stretching kilometers across, their walls rising in concentric ridges that follow curves too perfect to be accidental, too deliberate to be dismissed. They sit in deserts now, these circular scars upon the land. They rest beneath thin soil in regions where rain is a stranger and rivers are only the memory of what once flowed. And yet, when you stand at their edge, if you are fortunate enough, or perhaps cursed enough, to recognize what you are seeing, the air hums with a question that refuses silence. Who carved circles into continents? The academic answer comes quickly, reflexively, like a door closing before you can glimpse what lies beyond. Natural formations, salt flats, impact craters worn smooth by time, collapsed karst systems, volcanic calderas filled and forgotten. The explanations arrive with the weight of certainty, each one a small stone placed carefully to wall off the uncomfortable implications of what your eyes are telling you. And perhaps, in isolation, any single basin might surrender to such categorization. But they are not isolated. They are not singular. They appear across latitudes and longitudes with a frequency that troubles the comfortable rhythms of coincidence. From the air, they are unmistakable. Circles within circles. Rings that once held water, their beds still showing the faint striations of sediment laid down in layers, season after season, tide after tide, as if something vast and liquid once pulsed within these terrestrial vessels. The satellite images reveal patterns that ground-level exploration missed for decades, geometric precision hidden in plain sight, waiting for an altitude and angle that could see past the immediate texture of sand and stone to recognize the architecture beneath. In the northern reaches of Africa, where the Sahara stretches its golden amnesia across former wetlands, there are basins that show no volcanic signature, no meteor impact signature, no geological formation process that adequately explains their almost perfect circularity. Their walls are not random. Their depths graduate in steps, as if designed to hold water at different levels, as if engineered for control and containment rather than created by the blind processes of planetary formation. And when the light hits them at certain angles, dawn or dusk, when shadows deepen and reveal contours that noon's harsh glare erases, you can see the channels. Thin lines, ruler straight or curving with mathematical intent, connecting one basin to another, sometimes crossing dozens of kilometers of intervening landscape, as if someone drew liquid highways across the world's skin and then convinced the earth to remember them. Perhaps you feel it already, that slight vertigo that comes when a familiar landscape suddenly shifts its meaning, when the ground beneath accepted history begins to soften. If so, if this moment resonates with the part of you that has always suspected we are standing on a palimpsest of forgetting, then perhaps you'll stay. Not out of obligation, but out of that rare and precious curiosity that refuses to accept easy answers when extraordinary questions are being asked. Only if you sense, as I do, that some stories demand to be heard even when, especially when, they complicate everything we thought we understood about how civilizations emerge and what they choose to build. The first time a researcher suggested these basins were artificial, the response was what you might expect. Polite dismissal. Collegial concern about methodological rigor. The quiet marginalization that academia reserves for those who stray too far from consensus. Because to accept that these structures were engineered is to accept a cascade of uncomfortable implications. It means acknowledging a level of coordinated effort, a scale of labor organization, a sophistication of surveying and construction that supposedly did not exist in the time periods when these basins must have been created, if the dating of surrounding sediments and the archaeological layers that abut them are to be trusted. It means accepting that someone, at some point in the deep past, decided that humanity needed oceans where nature had not provided them. Not mere ponds, not irrigation channels or modest reservoirs, but circular seas, carved and shaped, possibly lined with materials that have since vanished into the geological churn, designed to hold volumes of water that dwarf modern reservoirs. The engineering required would be staggering by any measure. The planning would require geographical knowledge across hundreds or thousands of kilometers. The labor would consume generations. The purpose would have to be so compelling, so absolutely necessary, that entire civilizations oriented themselves around the project's completion. And here is where the silence in the tablets begins to whisper. Because in the fragmentary records that survive from the oldest literate cultures, those Sumerian inventories, those Egyptian administrative texts, those Indus Valley seals whose script still guards its secrets, there are phrases that have always seemed metaphorical. References to the ring seas, mentions of water circuits, descriptions of divine beings who carved the great circles so that heaven's waters might rest upon earth. These passages were long interpreted as mythology, as poetic embellishment, as the ancients' way of describing natural lakes or perhaps symbolic religious architecture. But what if they were describing exactly what they said they were describing? What if the metaphor is ours, not theirs, our modern impulse to translate their literal accounts into symbolic language because the literal meaning is too large, too technologically advanced, too architecturally ambitious for the timeline we have constructed for human civilization's adolescence? The basins are there. The channels are there. The evidence of massive hydrological engineering is carved into the patient skin of continents. What remains is the question of whether we possess the intellectual courage to see what our eyes are showing us, or whether we will continue to avert our gaze, finding safety in the stories we have already told ourselves about the limits of the ancient world. The desert wind moves across these empty circles now, carrying nothing but dust and the weight of forgetting. But once, if the shapes carved into stone are to be believed, if the whispers in clay tablets are to be heard, once these basins held the accumulated waters of civilizations that understood something fundamental about the relationship between land and liquid, between human intention and planetary transformation. Once, someone looked at the dry places of the world and refused to accept their emptiness. To understand what might have been built, we must first understand what building would have required. Imagine the problem. You stand at the center of a vast plain, surrounded by horizon in every direction, and you must create a perfect circle 5 kilometers across. Not approximately circular, not roughly round, but geometrically precise with deviations measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. You must do this without satellites, without GPS, without even the magnetic compass, which will not be invented for millennia. You have rope and stakes and the stars and the angles of shadows cast by the sun at different times of day. You have human feet to measure distance and human eyes to judge alignment. And yet, it must be perfect, because the circle you are creating is not decorative. It is functional. It must hold water without excessive seepage. Its walls must be angled correctly to resist the pressure of the liquid mass they will contain. Its depth must be calculated to achieve specific volumes. And it must connect, through carefully graded channels, to other circles, some nearby, some distant, forming a network, a web of artificial oceans that will transform the hydrology of entire regions. How do you begin? The question is not rhetorical. It is the central engineering challenge that separates speculation from serious consideration. Because if these basins are artificial, if they represent intentional human construction rather than geological accident, then whoever built them possessed surveying capabilities, mathematical sophistication, and organizational structures that rival or exceed those of civilizations we confidently understand. The mathematics alone are daunting. To lay out a large circle with precision requires understanding of pi to several decimal places, or at minimum a practical geometric method that achieves the same result through iterative approximation. You need to establish a central point and maintain perfectly consistent radial distances as you mark the perimeter. On flat ground, this is challenging but achievable. But many of these basins are located in terrain that rolls and dips, where maintaining true circularity requires constant adjustment for elevation changes, for the curvature of the Earth itself across distances measured in kilometers. Then there is the excavation. Conservative estimates suggest that creating even a modest basin, say, 3 kilometers in diameter and 20 meters deep at its center, would require moving approximately 10 million cubic meters of earth. That is 10 million cubic meters dug, carried, transported to the ridges that form the basin's walls, compacted, shaped, and stabilized. If we assume a workforce of 10,000 laborers, each moving 1 cubic meter per day, an optimistic estimate, the project would require nearly 3 years of continuous, coordinated effort. And that is for a single basin. The satellite evidence suggests dozens, perhaps hundreds, scattered across North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and intriguingly, in isolated regions of South America and Australia where no connection between ancient cultures is supposed to have existed. The labor organization required would be extraordinary. You would need surveyors to maintain the geometry, engineers to calculate the depth gradations and wall angles, architects to design the channels connecting one basin to another, administrators to coordinate the workforce, ensure consistent food and water supplies for thousands of laborers, maintain tool quality, resolve disputes, prevent accidents. You would need a writing system to record plans, track progress, communicate across the vast distances that separate basins in the network. You would need a mathematical notation capable of expressing the precise measurements and angles required. In short, you would need a civilization, not a tribe, not a loose confederation of villages, but a sophisticated, literate, technologically capable civilization with surplus production sufficient to support massive non-agricultural labor forces for extended periods. A civilization with reasons compelling enough to justify the staggering investment of resources, time, and human life that such projects would demand. And here the archaeological silence becomes almost deafening. Because in the regions where these basins exist, in the time periods when they must have been constructed, if the sediment layers and erosion patterns are correctly interpreted, we do not find evidence of civilizations matching that description. We find scattered settlements, early agricultural communities, the first tentative experiments with irrigation and seasonal water management. We do not find the administrative palaces, the extensive written records, the tool manufactories, the worker barracks, the vast granaries that would be necessary to support engineering projects of this magnitude. Either our dating is wrong, or our understanding of these cultures' capabilities is wrong, or the basins are not artificial. The third option is the safest. It requires no revision of established timelines, no uncomfortable expansion of ancient capabilities, no explanations for why such massive projects left so little trace in the material record we have recovered. And yet, the third option requires us to explain the channels. Those ruler straight lines connecting basins across empty kilometers. Those carefully graded waterways that show engineered slopes designed to move liquid from higher elevations to lower ones, creating flow, creating circulation, creating a system rather than isolated pools. Natural processes do not carve straight lines. Rivers meander. Erosion follows paths of least resistance, curving around obstacles, creating organic patterns that reflect the chaotic mathematics of fluid dynamics interacting with variable geology. But the channels connecting these basins are not organic. They are purposeful. They cut through ridges where a natural watercourse would have flowed around. They maintain consistent widths across their lengths. They show evidence, faint but present in the satellite imagery, of having been lined or reinforced, creating artificial banks that would prevent the water from spreading and dissipating into the surrounding soil. Someone engineered a circulatory system. Someone looked at a landscape and envisioned it transformed by liquid highways connecting artificial seas. Someone possessed not just the ability to execute such a vision but the reasons to attempt it in the first place. If you find yourself wondering about those reasons, if the question of purpose has begun to turn in your mind like a key searching for its lock, then perhaps you understand why this mystery refuses to rest quietly in the category of ancient curiosities. It pulls at the edges of everything we think we know about how civilizations develop, what they prioritize, what they consider possible. And if you feel that pull, if it resonates with something deeper than casual interest, then perhaps you'll continue to wander through this investigation with me, not as passive observers but as fellow questioners, equally invested in hearing what the silent stones might be trying to say. The engineering challenges are only the beginning. They establish the scale of ambition, the level of capability required. But they do not address the more fundamental mystery. Why? What purpose would drive a culture to reshape the hydrology of continents? What need was so great, so pressing, that it justified generations of labor, the diversion of vast resources, the organization of society around the single goal of creating oceans where none existed? The practical explanations suggest themselves immediately. Water storage for agriculture during dry seasons. Fishing reservoirs to supplement diet. Transportation networks allowing boats to move goods and people across otherwise impassable terrain. These are reasonable hypotheses, and they would explain circular basins on a modest scale, the irrigation ponds, the harbor facilities, the managed waterways that we know ancient civilizations created and that are well documented in both archaeological remains and historical records. But these basins are not modest. They are not village fish ponds or irrigation reservoirs. They are vast, interconnected, engineered on a scale that approaches the absurd if the only goal was practical water management for agriculture or transport. You do not carve a circular ocean 5 kilometers across simply to water crops. You do not create a network of such structures, linked by channels that might stretch 100 kilometers, just to facilitate boat traffic. The investment is too great, the ambition too grand, for purely utilitarian purposes, at least for utilitarian purposes as we understand them, which suggests that either the civilizations that created these structures faced challenges we cannot imagine from our comfortable distance, or the purposes served by these circular oceans went beyond the merely practical into realms we have not yet considered. There are stories preserved in the most fragile of mediums, clay pressed with reed, stone carved with copper, that speak of a time when the world was different, not metaphorically different, not spiritually or mythologically different, but literally, physically different in its fundamental arrangement. Stories that describe a landscape where water existed in configurations that no longer match the geography we inhabit, where seas existed that have left no trace in our modern understanding of ancient hydrology. The Sumerian texts, those earliest voices of literate humanity, contain references that have always troubled translators. Phrases that seem to describe the circular waters, or the ring seas of the ancestors. Passages that mention divine beings, those mysterious Anunnaki, about whom so much speculation has accumulated, who drew the great boundaries of water, and carved the circles so heaven might be reflected below. For generations, these passages were interpreted as cosmic mythology. Descriptions of the celestial ocean, perhaps, or symbolic representations of the circular horizon where sky meets earth. Religious poetry rather than historical record. But the interpretation required ignoring the specificity of the language. The texts do not speak in vague, metaphorical terms. They provide details, measurements sometimes, references to specific locations, descriptions of how water flowed from one circular sea to another, how the channels were maintained, how the fish populations were managed, how the boundaries between different sections were marked and controlled. This is not the language of myth. This is the language of administration, of record-keeping, of a bureaucratic apparatus documenting the maintenance and operation of physical infrastructure. And it is not only Sumerian texts. In the fragmentary remains of Egyptian records from the pre-dynastic periods, those shadowy centuries before the pharaohs, when Egyptian culture was supposedly still forming its fundamental characteristics, there are papyrus fragments that reference the people who dwelt by the ring waters. The context suggests these were not metaphorical waters. The fragments discuss trade goods exchanged with these people, specific types of fish caught in their circular seas, even disputes over water allocation between different circular basins. The Indus Valley Civilization, whose script remains undeciphered and whose cities show urban planning sophistication that startles archaeologists, left behind seals and tablets bearing symbols that some researchers believe represent water management systems. Circular forms connected by lines. Radiating patterns that could be symbolic but could equally be schematic. Diagrams of the very infrastructure we are now beginning to recognize in the landscape itself. Halfway around the world, in the Americas where no contact with these ancient Near Eastern cultures is supposed to have occurred, the oral traditions of certain indigenous peoples speak of the ancient ones who made the round lakes. These are not recent traditions. They are stories that predate European contact, preserved in languages and narrative structures that reach back into the genuine antiquity of the Americas. And while oral tradition is notoriously difficult to date with precision, The stories describe a time of massive earthworking, of peoples who could move mountains and make seas, of a world where water flowed in patterns dictated by human will rather than natural topography. Could all of this be coincidence? Could these scattered references across unconnected cultures simply reflect a universal human tendency toward certain metaphorical images? Circles, water, divine engineering? Perhaps. Certainly, that is the safest interpretation. But it requires us to ignore the specificity, the administrative details in the Sumerian texts, the trade records in the Egyptian fragments, the schematic precision of the Indus seals, the geographical accuracy in the oral traditions that describe basins whose actual locations can sometimes be identified in modern landscapes. What if they were all describing the same thing? Not because they were all the same culture or because some ancient globalized civilization connected them, but because the practice of creating circular oceans was more widespread than we have imagined. Because it represented a technological solution to environmental challenges that multiple cultures, independently, recognized and implemented, or perhaps more unsettlingly, because they were all inheriting the knowledge from something older, from a previous chapter of human organization that accomplished this feat and then, for reasons lost to the churn of forgetting, vanished, leaving behind only the massive scars of their ambition and the confused references in the records of those who came after, who found these structures and tried to understand who could have built them and why. This is where the mystery deepens from engineering puzzle into something that touches the fundamental questions of cultural memory and historical consciousness. Because if these basins are artificial, if they represent intentional construction, then someone built them. And if the civilizations we know about, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus cities, are describing them in their records rather than claiming credit for their construction, then we are facing one of two possibilities. Either these civilizations built the basins themselves and then somehow lost the memory of having done so, their later generations looking at the works of their ancestors and attributing them to gods or mythical predecessors. Or the basins predate these civilizations. They were inherited, found, incorporated into the landscape of emerging cultures who used them, maintained them, perhaps even expanded them, but who preserved in their earliest records the knowledge that they had not originated them, that they were the beneficiaries of engineering projects conceived and executed by others, by predecessors, by what the texts sometimes call those who came before the flood. The flood. That motif appears with such frequency across ancient cultures that it has become almost a cliché of alternative historical research. But the consistency is striking nonetheless. Sumerian, Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Mesoamerican, Pacific Islander traditions all preserve stories of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed a previous world, a previous order, a previous chapter of human civilization. And in many of these traditions, the pre-flood world is described as possessing knowledge, capabilities, and structures that the post-flood world had to slowly relearn or never quite recovered. What if the circular oceans were part of that previous world? What if they represent infrastructure from a time before the climate catastrophe, or geological event, or whatever actually happened that became mythologized as the flood? Infrastructure that was damaged, partially destroyed, left to erode and fill with sediment, but whose basic forms remained visible enough that later cultures recognized them as significant, tried to understand them, incorporated them into their own water management systems where possible, and preserved the memory that they were not the original builders? This interpretation requires accepting a much longer timeline for sophisticated human civilization than mainstream archaeology currently endorses. It requires positing that the organizational capabilities, mathematical knowledge, and engineering sophistication necessary to create these structures existed thousands of years earlier than we have evidence for in the traditional archaeological record. It requires explaining why we find these massive earthworks but relatively little other evidence of the civilization that created them. No cities that match the scale, no monumental architecture beyond the basins themselves, no written records that we can definitively attribute to these hypothetical engineers. Unless the basins themselves are the cities. Unless the circular oceans were not isolated infrastructure projects but the core organizational principle around which entire settlements were structured. Populations living along the ridges surrounding the water. Cultures whose entire social, economic, and religious life centered on the maintenance and use of these vast liquid resources. Civilizations for whom the distinction between natural and artificial landscape was meaningless because they inhabited a world entirely shaped by engineering, where every water source was managed, every flow controlled, every basin part of a greater hydrological network that spanned regions. If you let yourself imagine it, and I invite you to pause here, to close your eyes perhaps and truly imagine it, you can almost see it. Cities rising along the ridges of these circular seas. Boats crossing the vast central expanses, carrying goods and people between the settlements that ring the shores. Channels connecting basin to basin, allowing trade networks to span hundreds of kilometers through waterways that provided safer, faster transport than overland routes. A civilization whose entire identity was aquatic despite inhabiting regions that are now desert, whose technological focus was hydrology and hydraulics and water management on scales that make our modern reservoir systems seem almost quaint by comparison. And if that image stirs something in you, if it feels less like speculation and more like memory, like recognition of something that should be impossible but somehow resonates with a truth we have been conditioned to forget, then perhaps you'll continue with me into the deeper waters of this mystery. Not because I have answers, but because the questions themselves are worth dwelling within, worth turning over like strange shells found on a beach that should not exist. The evidence does not announce itself with clarity. It hides in plain sight, worn smooth by millennia, obscured by the very obviousness that makes it invisible. To see it requires a shift in perspective, a willingness to look at familiar landscapes with unfamiliar eyes. Requires asking what should not need to be asked. What is this circular depression in the desert, really? Why does it exist here, precisely here, at this size and depth? Why are there others like it, spaced at intervals that seem too regular for randomness, too deliberate for coincidence? The Rishaped structure in Mauritania is perhaps the most famous example. A massive circular formation in the Sahara, concentric rings stretching nearly 50 kilometers across, visible from space as a perfect bullseye in the sand. Geologists call it a deeply eroded dome, a geological curiosity formed by uplift and differential erosion of layered sedimentary rocks. The explanation is detailed, supported by mineralogical analysis, consistent with known geological processes. And it is almost certainly correct, at least in terms of the current structure's formation. But there are details that complicate the simple geological narrative. The precision of the circularity, the multiple concentric rings that maintain consistent spacing, the presence of what appear to be channel-like features radiating outward from the structure, cutting through the surrounding terrain in ways that erosion alone struggles to explain. And perhaps most intriguingly, the existence of archaeological sites around the structure's periphery. Sites that suggest human habitation during periods when the region was far wetter than it is now, when the Sahara was green and rivers flowed and large bodies of water dotted the landscape. Could the Rishaped structure have been one of these circular oceans? Could humans have found this natural circular formation and enhanced it, deepened it, carved channels to connect it to water sources, transformed a geological curiosity into the centerpiece of a hydrological network? The idea is speculative, impossible to prove with current evidence. But it demonstrates how these structures might have originated, not necessarily as entirely artificial creations carved into flat plains, but as human enhancement of natural features, taking what geology provided and reshaping it, extending it, engineering it into something that served purposes beyond what nature alone had created. This approach, enhancement rather than pure creation, would explain some of the puzzling aspects of the basins. Why they seem to follow natural topography in some aspects while violating it in others. Why they show both geological and artificial characteristics. Why dating them is so difficult, because distinguishing between natural formation and human modification becomes almost impossible when the modification is sophisticated enough to work with and amplify natural tendencies rather than fighting against them. It would also reduce the engineering challenge from impossible given known ancient capabilities to merely extraordinarily difficult but potentially achievable. You are not creating circularity from scratch on a flat plane. You are finding locations where geology has already done much of the work, natural depressions, collapsed volcanic calderas, impact craters, karst formations, and then applying human engineering to regularize them, deepen them, connect them, transform them from isolated features into integrated networks. The question then becomes, how many of the circular basins scattered across arid regions are purely natural, and how many show signs of this human enhancement? Distinguishing between the two requires detailed on-the-ground investigation, archaeological survey, careful examination of the basin walls for tool marks or artificial shaping, analysis of sediment layers for evidence of human activity, identification of artificial channels or deliberately constructed causeways and ridges. Some of this work has been done. In scattered locations, researchers have found evidence that is difficult to dismiss. In the western desert of Egypt, for example, there are circular depressions that show clear signs of having been modified, walls that have been built up with transported materials, channels that cut through rock in geometrically straight lines, evidence of settlements around the basin perimeters that include pottery, tools, and the remains of structures dating to periods when these basins would have held water. The same pattern appears in Central Asia, in regions where the Silk Road would later run. Circular basins, now dry and partially filled with sand, surrounded by the remains of what were clearly sophisticated settlements. Some of these sites are known to archaeology, catalogued as the ruins of oasis cities from historical periods. But the basins themselves are generally treated as natural features, convenient locations where groundwater collected, making them ideal spots for settlement. What if we have the causality backward? What if the basins came first, not as natural features but as engineered structures, and the settlements grew up around them because they provided guaranteed water sources in otherwise arid regions? What if what we are calling oasis cities are actually the descendants of much older populations who maintained and used hydrological infrastructure they inherited rather than created? This would explain a curious feature of many of these settlements. They seem to appear fully formed. Archaeological excavation reveals early layers that already show sophisticated urban planning, evidence of complex social organization, specialized craft production, trade networks. There is less evidence of gradual development than we would expect if these were new settlements learning to exploit newly discovered natural water sources. They have the character of populations already knowing how to organize themselves, already possessing the knowledge and skills necessary for urban life, simply reapplying those capabilities in new locations. Almost as if they were not inventing urban civilization but continuing it, restoring it, re-establishing in new locations what had existed before in the great ring cities that their traditions remembered but could no longer maintain in the original forms. The Ring Sea People. That phrase appears in fragmentary references across multiple ancient sources, and scholars have generally assumed it was a poetic or ethnic designation. A people who lived by the sea, perhaps, distinguished by their location near circular bays or coastal features. But what if it was a technical designation? A term for populations who possessed the specific knowledge of how to create and maintain circular ocean infrastructure. The Ring Sea People not as inhabitants of naturally occurring features but as the inheritors and practitioners of a specific engineering tradition, one that was already old, already fading, already becoming more myth than practiced craft by the time these references were written. In this interpretation, the scattered mentions of Ring Sea People across different cultures and time periods might represent the slow diffusion and ultimate loss of this knowledge. Early references describe them as powerful, as possessing special skills, as being sought out for consultation on water management projects. Later references speak of them in more legendary terms, as mysterious groups whose abilities exceeded those of ordinary peoples. The latest references remember them only as figures from the distant past, as ancestors who could accomplish feats that seem impossible to the writers recording the traditions. This progression, from contemporary specialists to legendary predecessors, mirrors what we see with many ancient technologies that were lost. The knowledge of how to create Damascus steel, for example. The techniques for Roman concrete that self-healed and strengthened over centuries. The methods for creating certain types of glazes, dyes, architectural acoustics. These technologies existed, were practiced, were even somewhat common in certain periods, and then were lost as the civilizations that developed them collapsed, fragmented, or transitioned to new economic and social systems that no longer valued or required those specific skills. Could the engineering of circular oceans have followed the same trajectory? A technology developed in response to specific environmental challenges, practiced and refined over generations, but ultimately lost as climatic changes, population movements, resource depletion, or simple cultural transitions made the maintenance of such massive infrastructure impractical or impossible. The timing would be significant. Many of these basins, if they are artificial, would need to date to periods of greater rainfall and different climate patterns than exist in their regions today. The Sahara, for example, went through extended wet periods, the so-called Green Sahara phases, when the region supported large lakes, flowing rivers, and vegetation sufficient for substantial human and animal populations. The most recent of these wet periods ended around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, transforming the region into the desert we know today. If the circular ocean technology was developed during the Green Sahara periods, it would have served a different purpose than we might initially assume. Not desperate water conservation in a desert environment, but perhaps optimization of water distribution in a wetland environment, management of seasonal flooding, creation of predictable, controlled water sources for agriculture and settlement in regions where water was plentiful but unreliable, subject to the vagaries of monsoon rains and river flooding. The engineering would make sense in that context. Circular basins designed to capture and store excess water during wet seasons, with channels allowing controlled release and distribution during dry periods. A system for smoothing out the fluctuations of a monsoon-driven climate, creating stability and predictability that would support larger populations and more complex social organizations than would be possible if communities remained dependent on the unreliable rhythms of seasonal rainfall. And then the climate changed. The rains failed. The Green Sahara began its slow transition to desert. The great circular oceans, designed for a wetter world, became increasingly difficult to maintain as the water sources that fed them dwindled. Populations would have had to adapt, either intensifying their water conservation efforts, trying to maintain the old systems with ever-decreasing resources, or abandoning them, moving to regions where water remained more accessible, leaving behind the massive earthworks that represented generations of their ancestors' labor. Both responses probably occurred. Some populations tried to maintain the old ways, perhaps succeeding for a while, perhaps managing to keep some basins functional even as others dried and filled with sand. Others migrated, carrying with them the knowledge of what had been, the memory of the ring seas, the techniques for creating them, the hope perhaps that in new lands they might recreate what had been lost. And in the process, the knowledge itself began to fragment. Parts preserved here, pieces remembered there, the full integrated understanding slowly dissolving across generations into scattered references, half-remembered techniques, and eventually myths about ancestors who could make seas where none existed. If this resonates, if the image of a civilization slowly losing the knowledge that had defined it, struggling to maintain infrastructure that was designed for a different climate and a different world, feels like it carries the weight of truth, then perhaps you understand why this mystery is not just about ancient engineering. It is about cultural memory and how knowledge disappears, about what we forget and why we forget it and what traces remain for those who come after, trying to understand what came before. To search for these structures is to train your eyes to see absence, to recognize the spaces where something should be but is not, where the landscape holds a shape that seems improbable, where the ordinary explanations do not quite fit the contours of what you are observing. It is a peculiar kind of archaeology, this hunting for basins that may or may not be artificial, that may represent the greatest earthworks in human history or merely the random vagaries of geological process. The satellite age has made this search possible in ways that ground-level investigation never could. From altitude, patterns emerge that are invisible to someone standing at the center of them. The human eye at ground level sees hills, ridges, depressions, the immediate texture of stone and sand and soil. But from above, from the perspective that orbital mechanics provides, those individual features resolve into larger forms. Circles become visible. Channels reveal themselves as coherent lines rather than scattered erosion gullies. The network structure, if it exists, becomes apparent. Researchers using satellite imagery have identified hundreds of circular and near-circular formations in desert regions around the world. Most are small, clearly natural features or modern human constructions, agricultural plots, water tanks, even the circular patterns created by center-pivot irrigation systems. But a subset defies easy categorization. Formations that are too large to be practical for known ancient water management techniques, too perfectly circular to be comfortably explained by erosion, too regularly spaced and too consistently oriented to dismiss as coincidental natural features. In North Africa alone, there are at least 40 such formations that warrant serious investigation. Some are well known, like the Rickhat structure. Others are virtually unknown outside of specialist geological surveys. Circular depressions in remote regions of Chad, Niger, Libya, Algeria, Sudan. Each has been catalogued, usually given a prosaic designation: circular feature A37, depression complex B12. Each has been tentatively classified according to the most likely geological explanation. And each remains, if you look at the details closely enough, slightly mysterious. The channels are what catch your attention once you know to look for them. Thin lines connecting one circular formation to another, sometimes visible only under specific lighting conditions, or in certain wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum that reveal moisture differences in the soil even thousands of years after water last flowed. These channels show characteristics that trouble simple geological explanation. They maintain consistent widths across their lengths. They cut through ridges and hills in straight or geometrically curved lines rather than following the path of least resistance that natural water flow would create. They sometimes show evidence of banks or berms along their edges, slight ridges that would have helped contain and direct water flow. In some locations, these channels are still functional, in a sense. During rare rain events, water does flow through them, following the ancient pathways, demonstrating that whatever created these features designed them well enough that they still serve their hydraulic purpose millennia later. The water collects in the circular basins, creating temporary lakes that last for weeks or months before evaporation reclaims them. And in those brief periods of wetness, the basins come alive. Birds descend in thousands. Fish appear, species that somehow survived in underground aquifers or as drought-resistant eggs buried in the sediment, waiting for water to return. Vegetation sprouts along the basin floors, creating circles of green in the surrounding brown desolation. It is almost as if the landscape remembers its original purpose. As if the engineering was so thoroughly integrated into the topography that even after thousands of years of abandonment, the system still functions when given the chance, still captures and holds water in the patterns its creators intended. This is what makes dismissal difficult. You can explain individual features. You can provide geological mechanisms for circular depressions, invoke known processes for channel formation, cite examples of natural hydraulic systems that create complex patterns. But the cumulative weight of the evidence, the quantity of similar formations, their geographical distribution, the consistency of their characteristics, the presence of undeniable artificial elements like berms and constructed ridges in association with some of them, the testimony of ancient texts describing exactly these kinds of features, begins to shift the balance of probability. It becomes less parsimonious to explain everything as coincidental natural features than to accept that at least some of these formations represent human engineering. The question then becomes not, are any of these artificial? But rather, how many are artificial, and which ones, and how do we tell the difference? There are researchers attempting to answer these questions through systematic survey and excavation. The work is slow, underfunded, and often politically complicated. Many of the most promising sites are in regions that are difficult to access due to political instability, lack of infrastructure, or simply extreme environmental conditions. Excavating in the Sahara is not trivial. Water must be transported in. Equipment must be protected from sand and heat. The remoteness means that field seasons are short and expensive. But where the work has been done, the results are intriguing. At several circular basin sites in North Africa, excavation has revealed artificial modifications to the basin walls, areas where the natural rock or soil has been cut away or built up with transported materials to create more regular surfaces, pottery and tool assemblages around the basin perimeters, indicating sustained human habitation during periods when the basins held water. Evidence of channel construction, including cut stones used to line channel beds, and the remains of what may have been control gates or sluices for managing water flow between basins. Sediment layers within the basins that show patterns consistent with managed water levels, evidence of periodic draining and refilling, of water level maintenance at specific depths, of sedimentation patterns that suggest the basins were actively maintained rather than simply allowed to naturally accumulate debris. This evidence does not prove the basins were created from scratch by human labor, but it demonstrates that humans significantly modified them, used them as part of managed hydrological systems, invested substantial effort in their maintenance and operation. It pushes the conversation beyond natural versus artificial into the more nuanced territory of natural features extensively engineered for human purposes. And that distinction may be the key to understanding the whole phenomenon. Perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the mystery is not, did ancient peoples have the capability to create circular oceans from nothing? But rather, did ancient peoples have the knowledge to recognize and enhance natural features, transforming them into integrated water management networks on scales far larger than we have credited them with achieving? The second question is more plausible from an engineering standpoint. It requires sophisticated knowledge of hydrology, geology, surveying, and long-term planning, but not supernatural or impossibly advanced capabilities. It is the kind of project that a motivated society with good organizational structures could conceivably accomplish over several generations, especially if they were facing environmental pressures that made reliable water management a matter of survival. It also fits better with what we know about how ancient engineering often worked. Ancient peoples were masters of working with natural features rather than against them. They built on bedrock where it was available rather than trying to create foundations in unstable soil. They diverted rivers using the river's own force, creating channels that followed natural gradients. They identified springs and aquifers and built their settlements around those reliable water sources. The idea that they would find natural circular depressions or impact craters or collapsed volcanic calderas and say, we can work with this, we can enhance this, we can connect these into a network, is entirely consistent with known ancient engineering philosophy. The scale remains impressive. Even if you are enhancing rather than creating, even if you are working with features that geology has provided, the scope of the project is vast. Connecting dozens of basins across hundreds of kilometers. Maintaining channel systems that require constant management to prevent clogging and erosion. Organizing the labor to keep such infrastructure functional across generations. This represents a level of societal coordination and technological capability that we do not normally associate with the time periods when this work must have been accomplished. Unless our time periods are wrong. Unless the assumption that sophisticated water management engineering only became possible after the rise of the first cities, after the invention of writing, after the development of bronze tools and centralized state bureaucracies, unless that assumption is built on incomplete evidence and circular reasoning that dates sites based on the artifacts found there, and then uses those dates to establish timelines for technological development that then reinforce the original dating assumptions. There is a growing recognition in archaeology that the timeline of human technological and social development may be more complex than the neat progression from hunter-gatherers to agricultural villages to cities to empires that has dominated thinking for the past century. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its massive carved stone pillars erected by people who were supposedly still hunter-gatherers, demonstrate that complex construction and social organization can predate the markers we thought were prerequisites for such capabilities. If pre-agricultural or early agricultural peoples could organize to create Göbekli Tepe, could they also have organized to enhance and connect natural water basins into regional management networks? Could the capabilities we are seeing evidence of in these circular ocean sites represent not impossibly advanced lost civilizations but simply a different developmental pathway than we expected? One focused on hydrological engineering rather than monumental architecture, on landscape modification rather than building construction? The myths speak in a language we have forgotten how to hear. They tell us about ring seas and water circuits, about divine engineers and predecessors who carved the great circles, and we nod at the poetic imagery while filing them under creation mythology or cultural symbolism. We have trained ourselves to hear metaphor where literal description might be recorded. We assume that ancient peoples spoke in symbols when they might have been preserving in the only medium available to them, oral tradition and fragmentary written record, the memory of actual engineering projects so vast that only divine agency seemed adequate explanation. Consider the Sumerian text's descriptions of the Anunnaki, those beings whose nature has been the subject of so much speculation, often veering into the fantastical. The texts describe them not as abstract deities but as administrators, as engineers, as beings who perform specific functions related to water management, agriculture, and the organization of labor. They drew the boundaries of the waters. They divided the channels. They assigned the streams to their courses. This is bureaucratic language, the language of hydraulic management. If you strip away the assumption that the Anunnaki must be supernatural beings and simply read the texts for what they describe these entities doing, you get a portrait of what we would call civil engineers and administrative officials overseeing large-scale water management projects. They survey, they plan, they direct labor, They maintain infrastructure. They resolve disputes over water allocation. These are the functions of a sophisticated hydrological bureaucracy, not the characteristics we typically associate with gods and myths. What if the Anunnaki were mythologized memory of an administrative class, a specialized group of engineers and planners who possessed the knowledge required to create and maintain the circular ocean networks? What if later generations, having lost or only partially retained that knowledge, trying to make sense of texts and ruins that spoke of capabilities they could no longer replicate, elevated these engineers to divine status? It is not an unreasonable progression. We see similar processes in historical times: the deification of founders, the mythologization of past rulers and teachers, the transformation of historical figures into legendary or divine beings as memory blurs across generations. The texts themselves suggest this interpretation in subtle ways. The Anunnaki are described as withdrawing, as leaving human affairs, as teaching humans to take over the functions they once performed. There is a clear sense of knowledge transfer, of humans learning to manage what the Anunnaki had created or controlled. This is not typically how myths describe divine beings. Gods in most traditions do not withdraw. They remain active or become distant but do not systematically teach humans to replace them in specific administrative and technical functions. But this is exactly how you would describe the transition from one civilization or ruling class to another if you were preserving that history in oral tradition that eventually became recorded as myth. The old order, the engineers and planners who created the circular ocean networks, for whatever reason, climate change, resource depletion, political collapse, could no longer maintain their position. The knowledge had to be transferred to new groups, new populations, who would maintain what they could of the old infrastructure and adapt to changing conditions. Over time, the original engineers became remembered not as human specialists but as something more than human, as beings whose capabilities exceeded normal human limits because the scale of what they accomplished seemed to exceed what ordinary humans could achieve. The Ring Sea people, in this interpretation, might have been the descendants or students of these original engineers, populations who retained portions of the knowledge, who could still manage and maintain existing basin systems even if they could no longer create new ones at the original scale. They would have been valuable, sought after for their specialized knowledge, perhaps itinerant specialists who traveled between different regions offering their expertise in water management. And as their knowledge faded, as the few who still understood the principles died without adequately training successors, the Ring Sea people would have transitioned from contemporary specialists to legendary figures to mythical ancestors. We are left, thousands of years later, with ruins we barely recognize and texts we do not know how to read literally. The landscape holds evidence that we interpret as geological accident or at best as modest human enhancement of natural features because the alternative, accepting that sophisticated hydrological engineering existed far earlier and at far larger scales than our models predict, requires rethinking too much of what we believe we understand about the pace and pattern of human technological development. But perhaps it is time to rethink. Perhaps the evidence is sufficient, once we allow ourselves to see it without the filtering assumption that ancient peoples were less capable than their accomplishments suggest. Perhaps the greatest barrier to recognizing these circular oceans for what they are is not lack of evidence but our own intellectual resistance to revising timelines and capabilities that have become comfortable, established, unquestioned. In the Egyptian traditions, there are references to the Zep Tepi, the first time, an era before the dynasties when the gods walked the earth and established the foundations of civilization. This era is usually interpreted as pure mythology, as the Egyptians' creation story explaining the origins of their cultural practices and religious beliefs. But elements of the Zep Tepi traditions describe specific acts of landscape engineering, the channeling of the Nile, the creation of irrigation systems, the establishment of the boundaries between cultivated land and desert. What if these traditions preserve memories of actual engineering projects, performed by human engineers whose capabilities seemed godlike to later generations who could not replicate the same feats? What if the gods of the first time were the Ring Sea people, or the predecessors of the Ring Sea people, or whatever we choose to call the civilization that possessed the knowledge to reshape regional hydrology at scales we are only now beginning to recognize? The same pattern appears in Hindu traditions about the Sarasvati River, a major waterway described in the Vedas but which no longer flows. Geological and archaeological investigation has revealed evidence of a large river system in northwestern India that dried up several thousand years ago as tectonic shifts and climate changes altered its course and water supply. The river described in the Vedas appears to be a genuine historical memory of this lost river system. But the Vedas also describe the Sarasvati as having been established by the gods, as having been channeled and directed by divine beings who taught humanity how to use its waters wisely. Pure mythology, or memory of hydraulic engineering projects associated with the ancient Sarasvati, projects whose scale and sophistication seem to later generations to require divine rather than human explanation. If the river was managed, if channels and reservoirs and diversion systems were created to optimize its use for irrigation and settlement, and if those systems were planned and executed by specialized engineers whom later generations came to regard as more than human, then the Vedic descriptions might be preserving actual history wrapped in the language of myth. And if such projects were undertaken in association with the Sarasvati, might they not also have included circular basin systems? Reservoirs designed to capture and store the river's water during flood seasons, connected by channels that distributed water during dry periods, creating the kind of integrated hydrological network that the satellite evidence suggests existed in other regions? There are circular formations in northwestern India and Pakistan that have not been adequately investigated. Some are known sites associated with Indus Valley civilization settlements, but others are in more remote areas, dismissed as natural features or simply not yet studied in detail. Given what we now suspect about circular ocean engineering in other regions, these formations warrant re-examination. The possibility exists that the Indus Valley civilization, whose sophistication in urban planning and water management is already well established, was not inventing these technologies but inheriting and adapting them from predecessors who had engineered the landscape on even larger scales. The pattern repeats itself across every major early civilization. Each has traditions of predecessors, of teachers, of divine or semi-divine beings who established the foundations of agricultural, architectural, and hydraulic knowledge. Each describes these predecessors as having capabilities that exceed what the historical civilization itself could accomplish. And each leaves behind landscape features, including circular or near-circular basins with associated channel systems, that are difficult to explain using only the known capabilities of the civilizations we have archaeological evidence for. Either we accept that these traditions are purely mythological, products of universal human psychological tendencies toward creating origin stories involving divine or heroic founders, with any correlation to actual landscape features being purely coincidental. Or we accept that the traditions preserve fragmented memories of earlier engineering projects, performed by human cultures whose full capabilities we have not yet recovered from the archaeological record, and that the landscape features represent the surviving evidence of those projects. The second interpretation requires humility. It requires acknowledging that our understanding of the human past is incomplete, that the archaeological record is fragmentary and biased toward certain kinds of evidence over others, that massive earthworks might survive in the landscape long after all other evidence of the cultures that created them has been erased by time and environmental change. It requires being willing to revise timelines, to expand our sense of what was possible in periods we thought we understood, to take seriously the engineering implications of landscape features we have dismissed as natural. But it has the advantage of explaining the evidence, both the physical evidence in the landscape and the textual evidence in the earliest records. It makes sense of patterns that are otherwise merely puzzling. It provides a coherent framework for understanding why so many early civilizations describe themselves as inheriting rather than inventing, as restoring rather than creating, as remembering rather than discovering. Perhaps we are not the first to ask these questions. Perhaps every few thousand years, humans reach a point where enough time has passed since the last great disruption that the landscape features no longer make obvious sense, and curious minds begin to wonder about the circular basins and the channels connecting them and the traditions that speak of ring seas and water circuits. Perhaps some of those curious minds find answers, or find enough evidence to convince themselves they have found answers, and then those answers too are lost in the next cycle of climate change or cultural collapse or simple forgetting. And we begin again, staring at satellite images, measuring circular formations, reading texts in languages that are only partially understood, trying to decide if what we are seeing is significant or coincidental, whether the patterns are revealing or simply revealing our own tendency to find patterns where none exist. But the basins remain, the channels remain, the texts remain, and the questions they pose have not been adequately answered by saying geology or mythology and moving on. They deserve more serious engagement than that. They deserve investigation undertaken with genuine openness to the possibility that the answers might be stranger, more impressive, and more unsettling to our established timelines than we have been willing to consider. Beyond the African continent, beyond the Middle Eastern cradle of early civilizations, the pattern persists with an insistence that troubles comfortable explanations. In Central Asia, across the steppes and deserts that stretch from the Caspian Sea to the borders of China, there are formations that satellite surveys have only recently begun to catalog in detail. Circular depressions, some filled with salt, others dry and empty, arranged in patterns that suggest connection even when the channels that might once have linked them are no longer visible at the surface. The Aral Sea region, before its modern catastrophic shrinkage, was surrounded by networks of ancient irrigation channels, some dating back thousands of years. But beneath and around these known historical irrigation systems, there are older features. Larger circular basins that the historical irrigation merely connected to and used but did not create. Formations that show characteristics similar to those we have examined in Africa, too circular, too precisely shaped, showing evidence of enhancement and modification that predates the cultures we have historical records for. In China, the ancient hydraulic engineering traditions speak of Yu the Great, a legendary emperor credited with controlling the floods and channeling the rivers of China into manageable courses. The traditional dating places Yu in the 3rd millennium BCE, at the very origins of Chinese civilization. The accounts describe him as having spent years traveling throughout China, organizing massive labor forces to dredge rivers, create channels, establish the boundaries between water and land. These accounts have always been treated as legendary, as mythologized memories of the genuine challenges early Chinese settlements faced with flood control and water management. But there are features in the Chinese landscape, particularly in the regions described as the focus of Yu's labors, that suggest something more than gradual local flood control measures. There are circular formations, now mostly filled in and overgrown, that appear in the archaeological surveys. There are channel systems that seem too extensive and too geometrically regular to be explained as simple river management. What if Yu the Great, whether a single historical figure or a mythologized representation of a period of intensive engineering, was not creating China's hydraulic infrastructure from nothing but rather restoring or connecting existing systems? What if the great floods he controlled were not natural disasters, but the result of the breakdown of older water management systems? And his achievement was not taming wild rivers, but rather repairing and adapting ancient infrastructure to serve the needs of China's emerging civilization. This interpretation, restoration rather than creation, appears repeatedly in the traditions. The heroes are not typically described as inventors but as restorers, as those who recovered lost knowledge or repaired damaged systems. This is an odd characteristic if the traditions are pure mythology, since mythological heroes are usually credited with original creation, with bringing into existence what did not exist before. But it makes perfect sense if the traditions are preserving memories of real historical processes where populations were indeed working with inherited infrastructure, trying to maintain or adapt systems whose origins were already lost to them. In South America, the pattern manifests in different environmental contexts but with surprisingly similar characteristics. The Bolivian Altiplano, the high plateau between the eastern and western ranges of the Andes, is dotted with what are called ancient sucacales, or raised field systems. Agricultural earthworks consisting of elevated planting surfaces surrounded by water channels. These are well-documented archaeological features, understood to be sophisticated agricultural technology that maximized productivity in the challenging high-altitude environment. But interspersed with these known agricultural systems are larger circular formations, some of which have been investigated and found to show evidence of much greater age than the raised field systems. These circular features are typically dismissed as natural depressions or small lakes, and in many cases that identification is correct. But some show characteristics that suggest enhancement, regularization of their circularity, channels connecting them that are too straight and too consistently graded to be natural drainage, evidence of constructed causeways crossing them or dividing them into sections. If you are searching for global patterns of circular ocean engineering, if you have trained your eye to recognize the characteristics that distinguish natural features from enhanced or created ones, these Bolivian formations begin to look familiar. Not identical to the African or Asian examples, the environmental context is too different, the available materials and geological substrate too distinct, but similar in their fundamental approach. Circular basins, connected by channels, integrated into a regional water management network. The Spanish chronicles of the conquest period contain scattered references to native traditions about ancestors who shaped the waters and carved the circles to hold the sky's gift. These references are fragmentary and filtered through the conqueror's limited understanding of native languages and worldviews. But they echo, in structure if not in detail, the Ring Sea traditions from other parts of the world. Could there have been independent invention of this technology? Could multiple cultures, facing water management challenges in different environments, have independently arrived at the solution of creating or enhancing circular basins and connecting them into networks? Absolutely. The circular form has advantages for water storage. It minimizes perimeter relative to area, reducing evaporation losses. It creates even pressure distribution on the walls, making them more stable. It is geometrically simple to lay out using rope and a central stake. Multiple inventions of the same basic technology in response to similar challenges is not only possible but probable. But the scale is what gives pause. These are not simple circular stock ponds or small irrigation reservoirs. The formations we are examining are vast, requiring extraordinary investments of labor and sophisticated understanding of regional hydrology. Independent invention of the basic concept, circular water storage, is plausible. Independent invention of continent-spanning networks of interconnected circular oceans, in regions separated by oceans and thousands of years and with no known contact, becomes increasingly difficult to explain through convergent evolution of technology alone. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable possibility: that the technology is not independently invented but genuinely ancient, genuinely global, predating the separation of the cultures we know about. That it represents knowledge from a time when human population movements, climate patterns, and sea levels were sufficiently different that connections existed which we no longer have clear evidence for. A time before the Younger Dryas, before the massive climate disruptions at the end of the last ice age, before the flooding of coastal regions and land bridges and the fragmentation of populations into isolated groups that would develop into the separate civilizations we study. This requires pushing the timeline back dramatically. It requires positing that sophisticated engineering knowledge existed during periods when we have very limited archaeological evidence for complex societies. It requires accepting that much of the evidence for such societies might have been destroyed by the very climate catastrophes that their traditions remember as floods and disasters. It requires humility about what we do not know and what the absence of evidence in the archaeological record might mean. The geological and climatic evidence for massive disruptions at the end of the Pleistocene is well established. Sea levels rose dramatically as the ice sheets melted, flooding coastal regions where much of human population would have been concentrated. Climate patterns shifted rapidly, turning grasslands to deserts and deserts to grasslands. Megafauna extinctions occurred globally. Human populations experienced severe disruptions, reflected in genetic bottlenecks and cultural discontinuities that show up in the archaeological record. If sophisticated hydrological engineering existed before these disruptions, if there were cultures that had developed the circular ocean technology and implemented it across large regions, what would survive? The infrastructure itself would survive, at least partially. Stone and earth are durable, and massive earthworks are difficult to completely erase even over millennia. But the cultures that created them might not survive as recognizable entities. Their settlements might have been in coastal regions now underwater. Their populations might have been decimated by the rapid climate changes, the survivors fragmenting into smaller groups that lost much of the original knowledge. The writing systems they used, if they had writing, might have been on perishable materials that left no trace. What would survive would be the landscape features themselves and the oral traditions, the memories of what had been, growing vaguer and more mythologized with each generation, until they became the foundation myths of the later civilizations that arose in the regions where the old infrastructure remained visible. This is speculation, and it is important to acknowledge it as such. But it is speculation that takes seriously the full range of evidence: the physical landscape features, the textual traditions, the climatic and geological context, the patterns that appear across multiple continents. It attempts to construct a framework that explains more of the evidence than the standard interpretations do, even if it requires revising timelines and expanding our sense of ancient capabilities in uncomfortable ways. Perhaps you feel the resistance rising. The voice that says this is going too far, that there is not enough evidence to support such dramatic reinterpretation, that we should not overturn established archaeological consensus based on ambiguous landscape features and fragmentary myths. That resistance is healthy, necessary even. It is what prevents us from accepting every alternative historical theory that gets proposed. But it should not prevent us from asking questions, from investigating, from taking seriously evidence that does not fit neatly into our current frameworks. The basins exist. The channels exist. The traditions exist. These are not speculative. They are documented features of the landscape and the historical record. What remains speculative is the interpretation, the attempt to understand what these features represent and how they came to exist. And in that interpretive space, we must balance skepticism with openness, maintaining rigorous standards of evidence while remaining willing to revise our understanding when the evidence warrants it. If you have stayed with me this far, through the technical discussions of surveying and excavation, through the exploration of myths and texts, through the increasingly speculative reconstruction of possible timelines and global patterns, then you understand that this is not about believing any particular explanation but about remaining curious, about allowing the mystery to retain its full weight without rushing to comfortable closure. The questions these circular oceans pose are worth dwelling within, worth continuing to investigate, worth taking seriously even when, perhaps especially when, they challenge our established understanding of what was possible in the deep human past. There is a peculiar quality to the way ancient texts describe water, not simply as a resource or a natural feature, but as something that requires management by beings whose relationship to humanity is ambiguous. The Sumerian term Abzu, the primordial waters, the deep, refers not just to a mythological concept, but to the literal groundwater, the aquifers and springs that provided water in a landscape where rainfall was uncertain and rivers could fail. The Abzu was managed, according to the texts, by Enki, one of the principal Anunnaki, whose role was specifically hydraulic administration. Enki's temple in Eridu, the oldest continuously inhabited city in Mesopotamia according to archaeological evidence, was built directly over a natural spring. The temple structure incorporated channels that directed the spring's water, creating a system where the sacred and the practical were inseparable. To manage the water was to perform a divine function. To engineer its flow was to participate in cosmic order. This is not unusual in ancient civilizations. The sacred and the hydraulic are consistently intertwined. Egyptian pharaohs performed rituals to ensure the Nile's inundation. Chinese emperors conducted sacrifices for rain and proper flow of rivers. Andean rulers mediated between human communities and the mountain spirits who controlled water sources. Water management was too important, too central to survival and prosperity, to be treated as merely a technical problem. It required the highest levels of social authority, the deepest integration with religious and political power. If the circular ocean systems were real, if they represented the kind of massive infrastructure investment that the landscape evidence suggests, they would necessarily have been sacred projects. Not because ancient peoples were more religious than we are, but because projects of that scale require ideological justification, require convincing populations to invest generations of labor in something whose benefits might not be fully realized in their lifetimes. You need more than practical arguments to maintain social cohesion around century-spanning projects. You need mythic frameworks, religious significance, the sense that the work is not merely utilitarian but cosmically necessary. This is why the ring seas appear in contexts that mix the administrative with the mythological. They are described in inventory lists and trade records, but also in cosmological texts and religious poetry. They were simultaneously practical infrastructure and sacred geography. The people who built and maintained them probably saw no contradiction in this. The distinction between secular and religious, between practical and sacred, is a relatively modern conceptual division that would have made little sense to ancient worldviews where every aspect of life was embedded in religious and cosmic significance. So when the texts tell us that the Anunnaki drew the boundaries of the waters, we should not assume this is purely metaphorical. It is metaphorical, certainly, in that it attributes the action to divine beings and frames it in cosmic terms. But it is also literal. It describes the actual practice of surveying and creating water management infrastructure, elevated to divine significance because of its importance to human survival and prosperity. The question of the Anunnaki's nature, gods, mythologized ancestors, ancient astronauts, administrative class, priestly engineers, is probably less important than understanding their function in the texts. They are the agents of cosmic order, the establishers of boundaries, the teachers of civilization's foundational knowledge. Whether you interpret them as literal divine beings, as mythologized human predecessors, or as symbolic representations of the knowledge itself, their role in the traditions is clear. They represent the origin point of sophisticated civilization, the source of knowledge that later generations receive as inheritance. And what they teach, consistently across multiple texts and traditions, is water management. Agriculture, yes. Writing and mathematics, certainly. Law and social organization, absolutely. But underlying all of these is hydrology. How to find water, how to store it, how to distribute it, how to prevent its destructive potential while harnessing its life-giving properties. This is the foundational knowledge, the prerequisite for all other advances, the technology without which no civilization can emerge in the arid and semi-arid regions where most early civilizations arose. If the Anunnaki represent memory of human engineers and planners who possessed advanced hydrological knowledge, then their teaching role in the myths makes perfect sense. The knowledge was passed down, from the original engineers to their students and successors, from the Ring Sea people to the populations who would maintain what they could of the inherited infrastructure. The teaching was remembered even as the teachers themselves were elevated to divine or semi-divine status, their human origins obscured by the passage of time and the natural human tendency to mythologize those whose capabilities seem to exceed normal human limits. In this framework, the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, their departure from active management of human affairs, represents the end of the era when the original engineering knowledge was intact and actively practiced. The knowledge didn't disappear overnight. The Ring Sea people and their successors maintained portions of it for centuries or millennia. But it was no longer being expanded, no longer being applied to create new basin networks at the original scale. The focus shifted from creation to maintenance, and eventually, as environmental conditions changed and the basins became harder to keep functional, from maintenance to abandonment. What remains in later periods are the ruins, the basins, the channels, the massive earthworks, and the traditions. The stories about ancestors who could reshape the world, who could make seas where none existed, who possessed knowledge that has been lost. These stories are dismissed as myth by modern scholarship because we lack the material evidence to support them. Or rather, we have not recognized the material evidence because it is so large, so integrated into the landscape itself, that we see it as geology rather than archaeology. But if we allow ourselves to see it differently, if we train our eyes to recognize the patterns, the evidence is there. It has always been there. We walk past it, photograph it from satellites, catalog it in geological surveys, and never quite see it for what it is. The surviving fragments of engineering projects so ambitious that later generations could only explain them by invoking divine agency. The flood myths take on new significance in this context. Nearly every ancient culture has traditions of a great flood that destroyed a previous world. The specifics vary, but the core narrative is consistent. A catastrophic inundation, a remnant of humanity saved, a world rebuilt on the ruins of what came before. These traditions have been analyzed from every possible angle: comparative mythology, psychological archetype, cultural diffusion, historical memory of real flood events. What if the flood traditions preserve memory of the failure of the circular ocean systems? Not a supernatural deluge sent by angry gods, but the catastrophic breakdown of hydrological infrastructure on a regional or even global scale. If you have engineered a landscape to hold and distribute vast quantities of water, if you have created circular oceans and channel networks that encompass entire regions, then the failure of that system, due to climate change, tectonic activity, simple structural failure of critical components, would be experienced as a flood of civilizational-ending magnitude. The water that was carefully contained and controlled is suddenly released. Channels designed to distribute water at controlled rates become torrents. Basins overflow or rupture. Populations living in the lowlands below basin systems, populations that had never known those basins to fail, would be inundated with little warning. The destruction would be total, the death toll catastrophic, the social and economic disruption so complete that recovery would take generations. And in the aftermath, the survivors would tell stories. Stories about how the waters that their ancestors had shaped and controlled were released, how the old world drowned, how only a few survived to carry forward the knowledge into a new and diminished age. Over time, the specifics would blur. The mechanism, infrastructure failure, would be forgotten or simplified. The narrative would focus on survival, on divine intervention, on the beginning of the current world order from the ending of the previous one. This interpretation does not require choosing between myth and history. It recognizes that myths can preserve historical memory while transforming it into narrative forms that serve cultural and religious functions. The flood happened, in the sense that catastrophic water-related disasters occurred that destroyed previous forms of social organization and reshaped cultural memory. But the flood was not a single event at a specific moment in time. It was the long process of environmental change and infrastructure failure that marked the transition from one era of human civilization to another. The circular oceans in this reading are both older and more recent than we might expect. Older in that they were built during the pre-flood world, the era when sophisticated hydrological engineering was practiced at scales we do not see in the historical period. More recent in that some basins were maintained, adapted, and even created by post-flood civilizations who retained partial knowledge of the old techniques but could no longer implement them at the original scope. We are left in a strange position, we who come so many thousands of years later. We have the ruins, but we don't recognize them as ruins. We have the texts, but we read them as myths. We have the engineering capabilities to understand what would have been required to create these structures, but we have trouble accepting that such capabilities existed when and where they must have existed if the structures are artificial. Our intellectual frameworks, designed to make sense of the evidence we have, become obstacles to recognizing evidence that doesn't fit those frameworks. Breaking through requires a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge that our understanding is incomplete, that the absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. It requires resisting the temptation to rush to conclusions, either dismissing the circular basins as purely natural or embracing elaborate theories of lost supercivilizations without adequate supporting evidence. The truth, whatever it is, likely lies in a middle ground that acknowledges both the genuine sophistication of ancient engineering and the limits of what we can definitively prove from fragmentary evidence. What we can say with confidence is this: the landscape holds forms that warrant serious investigation. The traditions contain elements that deserve to be taken more literally than they have been. The engineering capabilities of ancient peoples were probably greater than mainstream archaeology has credited, particularly in the realm of earthwork and hydraulic engineering. And the timeline of human technological development is more complex, more varied, more surprising than the neat progressive narrative from primitive to advanced would suggest. Beyond that, we enter the realm of interpretation, hypothesis, and speculation, which is not a failing. It is the nature of investigating deep history, where evidence is limited and fragmentation is the rule rather than the exception. We do our best to construct coherent narratives from the pieces that survive, knowing that future discoveries might require revising or abandoning those narratives, but also knowing that the effort to understand is worthwhile even when certainty remains elusive. As we search for purpose, we confront perhaps the deepest mystery of all. Even if we accept that the circular basins are artificial, even if we acknowledge the evidence of massive hydrological engineering, the question remains, why? Why this specific form? Why circular oceans rather than more conventional reservoirs and canal systems? Why invest such extraordinary resources in infrastructure whose function is not immediately obvious from the structures themselves? The practical explanations have been discussed: water storage, irrigation, transportation, fishing. And certainly, these functions would have been served by circular basin systems. But as primary purposes, they feel insufficient to explain the scale and the specific geometry. There are more efficient forms for simple water storage, more practical layouts for irrigation distribution, more direct routes for transportation networks. The circularity itself, maintained with such precision across such large scales, suggests that the form was important in ways beyond pure utilitarian efficiency. Could there have been astronomical significance? Circular structures aligned to solar, lunar, or stellar phenomena appear in many ancient cultures. Stone circles, circular temples, circular cities, the form seems to carry meaning beyond its practical properties. If the circular basins were aligned to celestial phenomena, oriented to mark solstices or equinoxes or the rising of particular stars, they would represent the largest astronomical instruments ever created, observational tools on a scale that dwarfs Stonehenge or the Nazca Lines. There is some evidence that could support this interpretation. Several of the basin complexes, when analyzed for orientation, show alignments that correlate with astronomical phenomena. The channels connecting basins sometimes point to significant horizon positions, where the sun rises on the solstices, where certain bright stars appear at particular times of year. But the correlations are not perfect, and the analysis is complicated by the difficulty of determining which features are original and which are later modifications or natural erosion. Even if astronomical alignment was a factor, it doesn't fully explain the purpose. Why would you need an astronomical instrument that also holds millions of cubic meters of water? Why not create the astronomical markers separately from the water storage infrastructure? Unless the water itself was part of the astronomical function, the circular seas serving as vast mirrors for observing the sky, as reflecting pools that would allow simultaneous observation of celestial phenomena and their reflections, creating a meditative or sacred space where heaven and earth met in the mirror of human-shaped water. This interpretation has a certain poetic appeal. It fits with ancient cosmological concepts about the relationship between terrestrial waters and celestial waters, about the sky as an ocean and the ocean as a sky. In many ancient worldviews, water was the boundary between realms, the mirror that connected earth to heaven, the medium through which the divine could be perceived and contacted. Creating vast circular mirrors, carefully shaped and positioned to reflect the sky, would serve both practical and sacred purposes. Water storage that also functioned as sacred geography, infrastructure that was simultaneously cosmological statement. But we are speculating now, filling in the gaps in our knowledge with interpretations that, while plausible, cannot be definitively proven from the evidence we currently have. And that itself is significant. The mystery persists. The purpose remains elusive. Even if we eventually achieve consensus that these basins are artificial, that they represent sophisticated ancient engineering, the question of why they were built in this specific form, what functions they served beyond the obvious. Practical ones, what the civilizations that created them believed they were accomplishing. These questions may remain forever partially answered, the intentions of long-dead engineers accessible to us only through the mute testimony of stone and earth and the fragmentary whispers of texts whose full context we have lost. Perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps it is even necessary. The moment we think we fully understand the past, we stop seeing its strangeness, stop recognizing how different ancient worldviews were from our own. The uncertainty keeps us humble, keeps us questioning, prevents us from projecting our own assumptions onto peoples whose motivations and beliefs may have been radically different from anything we can easily imagine. There is another possibility, one that is both more mundane and in some ways more unsettling. What if the circular basins had no single grand purpose? What if they were, like so many human constructions, multifunctional, serving practical needs while also fulfilling social, political, and religious functions? What if they were massive public works projects whose primary purpose was social cohesion, the very act of building them serving to organize and unite populations across regions, to demonstrate the power and capability of ruling elites, to create shared identity through shared labor? This interpretation is consistent with what we know about many large-scale ancient construction projects. The pyramids, the Great Walls, the monumental temples, these structures served multiple functions simultaneously. They were tombs, yes, but also demonstrations of state power, religious statements, economic projects that organized and employed labor forces, architectural innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. They were not built for single purposes but were deeply embedded in the social, economic, political, and religious fabric of the civilizations that created them. The circular oceans, if they existed, would have functioned similarly. Water storage and management would have been crucial functions, perhaps the justifying function, the practical reason that made the projects possible. But the actual building of them would have served other purposes. Employing labor forces, demonstrating organizational capabilities, creating monuments that reinforced social hierarchies, providing sacred spaces that connected communities to their cosmological beliefs. generating economic activity through the support of large worker populations, training engineers and administrators, spreading technological knowledge across regions. In this view, asking what were they for is the wrong question, or at least an incomplete question. They were for everything. They were the project that organized society, that gave structure and meaning to collective effort, that transformed populations of scattered settlements into unified civilizations capable of conceiving and executing works that span generations. The circular basins would have been simultaneously granaries and temples, reservoirs and astronomical observatories, transportation networks and sacred sites, practical infrastructure and political statements. And perhaps that multifunctionality is why the knowledge of how to create them was lost. When a technology serves a single clear purpose, it tends to be preserved as long as that purpose remains relevant. But when a technology is embedded in a complex web of social, political, and religious functions, its preservation depends on maintaining that entire cultural context. If the society collapses, if the environmental conditions change, if the political structures that organize the labor fail, if the religious frameworks that gave the work meaning are displaced by new belief systems, then the technology can be lost even though its products remain visible in the landscape. This is what may have happened with the circular ocean technology. It wasn't just a technique for creating reservoirs. It was a civilizational paradigm, a way of organizing society around massive long-term hydrological engineering projects. When the environmental and social conditions that made such projects possible and necessary changed, when climates shifted, when populations fragmented, when new forms of social organization emerged, the entire paradigm was abandoned. The basins remained, some perhaps still functional and maintained for centuries or millennia. But the knowledge of how to create new ones at the original scale, the social structures that could organize such projects, the religious and political frameworks that gave them meaning, all of that was lost or transformed beyond recognition. Later civilizations inherited the basins, used them where they could, maintained them where it was practical, but no longer understood them as part of a larger integrated system. They became isolated features, convenient water sources, mysterious ruins attributed to gods or legendary ancestors. The knowledge fragmented, pieces preserved here and there, surveying techniques, astronomical alignment methods, hydraulic engineering principles, but the integrated whole, the complete paradigm of circular ocean engineering was lost. And so we find ourselves, thousands of years later, staring at satellite images of circular depressions in deserts, reading fragmentary texts about ring seas and water circuits, trying to reassemble from these scattered pieces something approaching understanding of what was built and why. It is detective work across millennia, archaeology at the largest possible scale, attempting to reconstruct not just individual sites but entire technological and social paradigms from the fragments that survived. If you have followed this investigation to this point, if you have allowed yourself to consider the possibilities even while maintaining appropriate skepticism, then you understand that we are not searching for simple answers. We are not trying to prove a particular theory or validate a specific alternative historical model. We are simply trying to see more clearly, to recognize patterns that have been hiding in plain sight, to take seriously evidence that deserves serious consideration even if it complicates our established understanding. The circular basins exist. That is not speculation. The question is what they represent: pure geology, human-enhanced natural features, or fully artificial constructions. And while that question remains debated, while the evidence is not yet definitive enough to satisfy all skeptics, the investigation itself is valuable. Because in the process of investigating, we learn. We develop new methods for analyzing ancient landscapes. We begin to question assumptions about ancient capabilities. We take ancient texts more seriously as potential sources of historical information rather than dismissing them automatically as myth. We expand our sense of what might be possible, what might remain to be discovered in the fragmentary evidence of the deep past. And we remember humility. We remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that the archaeological record is incomplete and biased, that our understanding is always provisional and subject to revision as new evidence emerges. We remember that people separated from us by thousands of years might have had different priorities, different capabilities, different relationships with their landscapes than we can easily imagine from our modern perspective. The circular oceans, if that is what they are, remind us of these things. They stand as monuments to human ambition and capability, to the power of organized effort sustained across generations, to the sophisticated engineering that is possible even with relatively simple tools when knowledge and determination and social cohesion align. They remind us that history is deeper, stranger, more complex than the simplified narratives we learn in school. And they invite us to keep questioning, keep investigating, keep allowing the past to surprise us with its achievements and its mysteries. In the end, we return to water, to its necessity, its power, its presence in every origin story humanity has told itself. Water as creation and destruction, as life-giver and flood-bringer, as the boundary between realms and the medium of transformation. Our relationship with water has always been existential. We are made of it, sustained by it, threatened by it, shaped by our access to it or lack thereof. So perhaps it should not surprise us that some ancient peoples, whether in the distant past we can barely glimpse or at the dawn of the civilizations we know, decided to reshape that relationship fundamentally. Not merely to adapt to the water sources nature provided, but to become architects of water itself, to carve into the Earth's surface the containers and channels that would allow human intention to trump natural distribution, that would make the desert bloom, that would create seas where none had existed. This is not unprecedented in the civilizations we know well. The Romans built aqueducts that spanned countries, bringing water hundreds of kilometers from mountain sources to their cities. The Nabateans of Petra created sophisticated water management systems in one of the world's most arid regions, catching every drop of rare rainfall and distributing it with such precision that they supported a thriving city. The Angkor civilization in Cambodia built vast barrays, rectangular reservoirs that held millions of cubic meters of water, integrated into temple complexes that combined practical irrigation with religious symbolism. So we know that ancient peoples could and did create massive water management systems. We know that such projects were central to the development and maintenance of complex civilizations. We know that the engineering knowledge and organizational capabilities existed. What we have been exploring is whether this capability extended further than we have recognized. Whether there were projects even larger, even more ambitious, operating on scales that make the Roman aqueducts and Angkor barrays seem almost modest by comparison. Whether the circular basins scattered across continents represent evidence of such projects, or whether they are, as mainstream archaeology maintains, primarily natural features perhaps modestly enhanced for local use. The definitive answer remains elusive. More investigation is needed: systematic survey, careful excavation, detailed analysis of sediments and construction techniques, comprehensive comparison of sites across regions. The work is difficult, expensive, often inaccessible due to political or environmental challenges. But it is being done, slowly, by researchers who recognize that these questions are worth pursuing even without certainty of finding conclusive answers. What can be said even now is that the possibility deserves serious consideration. The evidence is sufficient to warrant investigation, insufficient to compel belief, but collectively suggestive enough that dismissal without careful examination is intellectually unjustified. The circular basins exist. The channels exist. The texts exist. These facts are not in dispute. The interpretation remains open, the debate continues, and that is as it should be. This is how knowledge advances, through questioning, investigation, debate, revision, the gradual accumulation of evidence that slowly tips the balance of probability in one direction or another. But beyond the specific question of the circular basins, there is a larger issue at stake. How we think about ancient peoples and their capabilities. How we interpret the evidence of the past. How willing we are to revise our understanding when new evidence or new perspectives challenge established models. For too long, there has been a tendency in archaeology and ancient history to underestimate ancient capabilities. To assume that peoples without modern technology were necessarily primitive, that the absence of certain artifacts means the absence of the knowledge or capability to create them, that we moderns are the pinnacle of human achievement and everyone before us was groping in comparative darkness. This attitude is both arrogant and demonstrably false. Ancient peoples were as intelligent as we are. They had thousands of years to develop sophisticated technologies and social organizations. They accomplished feats that we still struggle to fully understand or replicate: the precision of Egyptian pyramid construction, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge encoded in Mayan calendars, the metallurgy of Damascus steel, the acoustic properties of ancient theaters, the seismic resistance of Incan stonework. Why, then, should we assume that sophisticated hydrological engineering at large scales was beyond them? Why should we be skeptical when landscape features and ancient texts suggest exactly such engineering? The skepticism should not be directed at the possibility itself but at the quality of evidence supporting it. We should be demanding rigorous proof, careful analysis, multiple lines of evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. But we should not be dismissing the possibility a priori simply because it challenges our assumptions about ancient capabilities or requires revising established timelines. This is the intellectual stance that the circular ocean mystery invites us to adopt. Not credulous acceptance of every alternative theory, but genuine openness to evidence that challenges orthodoxy. Willingness to investigate seriously, to follow the evidence where it leads, to revise understanding when revision is warranted. Combined with equally firm commitment to rigorous standards of proof, to skepticism of claims that lack adequate evidence, to acknowledging uncertainty when certainty is not justified by the available data. It is a difficult balance to maintain. The pull toward certainty is strong, either the certainty of traditional explanations or the certainty of alternative theories. But the honest intellectual position on most questions about the deep past is uncertainty. We have fragments. We have clues. We have evidence that suggests possibilities but rarely proves them beyond doubt. We construct narratives, we develop models, we offer interpretations, but we hold them lightly, ready to revise when new information emerges. The circular basins will likely remain mysterious for some time. Perhaps they will eventually be definitively proven to be artificial, products of sophisticated ancient engineering, monuments to human ambition and capability that will require rewriting significant portions of our understanding of ancient civilizations. Perhaps they will be demonstrated to be primarily natural features, interesting geological formations that have captured our imagination but do not represent human construction. Perhaps the answer will be, as is so often the case, more complex. Some artificial, some natural, some enhanced natural features, requiring case-by-case analysis rather than sweeping categorical answers. Whatever the eventual resolution, the investigation will have been worthwhile. We will have learned more about ancient landscapes, ancient engineering, ancient water management. We will have developed new analytical tools, new perspectives, new questions. We will have reminded ourselves that the past still holds mysteries, that there are still discoveries to be made, that the story of human civilization is not yet fully told. And we will have grappled with the fundamental questions that the circular oceans pose. Questions about memory and forgetting, about what survives and what is lost, about how we know what we think we know about the past. Questions about human capability and ambition, about what is possible with determined effort and sophisticated knowledge even with relatively simple tools. Questions about the relationship between humans and landscapes, about the line, if there is one, between natural and artificial, between finding and making, between inheriting and creating. These are not merely archaeological or historical questions. They are philosophical questions that touch on who we are as a species, how we understand our place in the world, how we relate to the achievements and knowledge of those who came before us. They are questions worth asking even when answers remain elusive, worth investigating even when certainty remains impossible, worth contemplating even when the evidence is fragmentary and the interpretations contested. If you have journeyed with me through this investigation, through the satellite images and the ancient texts, through the engineering calculations and the mythological references, through the speculation and the evidence and the uncertainty, then you have already understood this. You have understood that the value is not in reaching a definitive answer but in the process of questioning itself, in the willingness to look closely at what might be easily dismissed, to consider seriously what might seem implausible, to remain curious about a past that refuses to surrender all its secrets. The circular basins remain in the desert, worn by wind and time, holding their shapes against erosion, waiting for us to understand what they represent. The channels still catch occasional rainwater, still directed along paths carved thousands of years ago, still functioning in their diminished way as they were designed to function. The texts still speak of ring seas and water circuits, of divine engineers and ancestors who shaped the world, their words preserved on clay tablets and fragmentary papyri, waiting for us to hear what they are actually saying beneath the layers of myth and mistranslation. And we continue to investigate, to question, to debate, to slowly accumulate evidence and develop understanding. We use modern technology, satellites and computers and chemical analysis to probe ancient mysteries. We bring multiple disciplines, archaeology, geology, hydrology, linguistics, comparative mythology, to bear on questions that resist simple answers. We collaborate across borders and specializations, sharing data and insights, building collective knowledge that no single researcher or discipline could achieve alone. This is humanity's project, in a sense. Understanding our own past, recovering knowledge that was lost, recognizing achievements that have been forgotten, honoring the ingenuity and determination of those who came before by taking seriously what they accomplished and what they tried to tell us about their accomplishments. The circular oceans, if that is what they are, if we eventually conclude that the evidence supports that interpretation, would represent one of humanity's greatest achievements. Not just engineering achievements, though the engineering would be extraordinary, but achievements of organization, of long-term planning, of coordinating effort across generations, of envisioning a transformed landscape and having the sustained commitment to make that vision real. Even if they are primarily natural features, perhaps modestly enhanced, they have still served a purpose. They have made us question our assumptions. They have driven investigation that has increased our knowledge. They have reminded us that the past is not fully known, that mysteries remain, that there is still value in looking closely at familiar landscapes with unfamiliar eyes. As we stand now, in the early decades of the 21st century, with our own technological capabilities for reshaping landscapes and managing water resources, perhaps we can appreciate more fully what these ancient engineers, if they existed, were attempting. We face our own water management challenges, our own questions about how to distribute scarce resources, our own debates about massive infrastructure projects and their environmental and social impacts. The circular basins, whether ancient human-made or natural, whether monuments to lost civilizations or merely interesting geology, speak to these contemporary concerns. They remind us that water management has always been central to human civilization, that the challenges we face are not entirely new, even if the scale and context have changed, that solutions require long-term thinking, sophisticated engineering, social cooperation, and willingness to invest in infrastructure whose benefits may extend across generations. And they remind us to maintain perspective, to remember that we are part of a long human story, inheritors of knowledge and capabilities developed over millennia, standing on foundations laid by countless generations before us. To recognize that what we accomplish will in turn become the foundation for those who come after, who may look back at our works with the same mixture of admiration and puzzlement that we direct toward the works of the ancients. Perhaps they will understand our purposes better than we understand the purposes of those who may have carved the circular oceans. Perhaps they will have evidence we lack, perspectives we cannot imagine, analytical tools we have not invented. Perhaps they will read these very words and smile at our uncertainty, our speculation, our attempts to understand with incomplete evidence and fragmentary clues. Or perhaps they will face the same mysteries, the same questions, because the nature of deep history is such that certainty always remains elusive, evidence always remains fragmentary, and each generation must construct its own understanding from the pieces that survive. If this investigation has sparked your curiosity, if the questions we have explored feel important to you, if you find yourself looking at landscapes differently or thinking about ancient texts with fresh perspective, then the purpose has been served. Not to convince you of any particular interpretation, not to claim that the circular ocean theory is proven or disproven, but simply to invite you into the process of questioning, investigating, wondering about a past that is stranger and more complex than we often imagine. Perhaps you will share these ideas, continue the conversation, add your own perspectives and insights. Perhaps you will investigate further, seek out academic papers or books that explore these questions in greater depth, even visit some of these sites if opportunity allows. Perhaps you will simply carry forward a slightly different sense of what might be possible in human history, what might remain to be discovered in the fragmentary evidence of the deep past. Whatever your path forward, thank you for wandering through this mystery with me, for allowing the questions to remain open even when answers prove elusive, for considering possibilities that challenge comfortable certainties, for recognizing that the past deserves our serious attention our rigorous investigation, and our willingness to be surprised by what it might reveal. The circular oceans remain, whether as monuments or as natural features. The texts remain, whether as history or as mythology. The questions remain, whether answerable or eternally mysterious. And we remain, seekers of understanding in a world that reveals its secrets slowly, incompletely, and always with room for wonder. There is a specific kind of silence that follows questions without answers. Not the silence of closure, of satisfying conclusion, but the silence of suspension, the intellectual hovering in a space where evidence pulls in multiple directions and certainty remains just beyond reach. This is where we find ourselves with the circular basins, poised between recognition and skepticism, between the possibility of extraordinary ancient achievement and the caution of requiring extraordinary proof. Let us examine more closely some of the specific sites that anchor this investigation, the places where the circular basin phenomenon is most visible and most troubling to simple geological explanations. The Saharan complex in southern Mauritania and northern Mali represents perhaps the most extensive network of circular formations outside of the Richat structure itself. Satellite surveys have identified at least 17 major circular depressions within a 200-kilometer radius, ranging from 2 to 7 kilometers in diameter. What makes this complex particularly intriguing is the visible channel system connecting many of these basins. The channels are not continuous, erosion and sand accumulation have obscured sections, but enough remains visible in the imagery to suggest that these formations were, at some point, hydraulically linked. Ground-level investigation of this complex has been limited due to accessibility challenges. The region is remote, politically unstable, and environmentally harsh. But the limited surveys that have been conducted found several key pieces of evidence. At 3 different basin sites, excavation revealed artificial stone linings along portions of the basin walls. The stones show evidence of having been shaped, not extensively carved, but definitely worked to create flatter surfaces that would fit together more tightly. The construction technique is crude by later Roman or medieval standards, but it is clearly intentional modification rather than natural stone arrangement. Pottery fragments recovered from excavation layers just above the basin floors date to the Middle Holocene period, roughly 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. This places human activity at these sites during the African humid period when the Sahara was much wetter. But the pottery is found in contexts that suggest the people were not simply camping near natural water sources but were actively involved with maintaining or using artificial structures. Chemical analysis of sediment cores from basin floors shows patterns of cyclic filling and draining that do not match the patterns expected from natural lake systems in the region. Natural lakes in paleoclimatic reconstructions show gradual accumulation of sediment with occasional rapid deposition events corresponding to flood periods. The basin sediments show more regular cycling, suggesting controlled filling and draining on seasonal or multi-year rhythms. This evidence does not prove that the basins were entirely artificial, but it demonstrates human involvement in their construction or modification at levels beyond simple opportunistic use of natural features. Someone invested significant effort in enhancing these basins, lining at least portions of them with stone, using them as part of managed water systems rather than as passive water sources. In Central Asia, the Aral Sea periphery presents a different but equally compelling pattern. Here the basins are generally smaller, 1 to 3 kilometers in diameter, but more numerous and more clearly networked. Pre-Soviet-era surveys documented what were described as ancient irrigation channels of unknown origin, connecting dozens of circular and near-circular depressions across the region. Many of these features were destroyed or heavily modified during the 20th century Soviet irrigation projects, but historical photographs and maps preserve evidence of their original extent. What makes the Aral region significant is the presence of associated archaeological sites that clearly predate the known historical civilizations of Central Asia. Stone tools and early pottery styles found at these sites suggest occupation during the Neolithic period, potentially as early as 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. Yet the sites show evidence of settled rather than nomadic occupation, permanent structures, storage facilities, specialized craft production, at dates when conventional archaeological models would expect only mobile hunter-gatherer populations in this region. The interpretation that best explains this pattern is that these early populations had access to reliable water sources that made settled existence possible even before the development of agriculture would normally have supported such lifestyles. The circular basin systems, if they were functional during this period, would have provided exactly such reliable water sources, potentially fed by snowmelt from nearby mountain ranges and managed to provide year-round water availability. In South America, the Altiplano formations present the challenge of distinguishing between the well-documented raised field agricultural systems and older, larger circular features that may predate them. Recent LiDAR surveys, using laser scanning from aircraft to penetrate vegetation and create detailed topographic maps, have revealed the extent of ancient earthworks on the Altiplano far exceeds what was visible from ground level or conventional aerial photography. Among these earthworks are circular formations that do not fit the pattern of raised field agriculture. They are too large, too deep, and lacking the characteristic planting surface that defines raised fields. Some are positioned at locations where they would have intercepted glacial meltwater flows from the Andes, suggesting they may have functioned as collection and distribution points for seasonal water resources. Dating these features is problematic because the Altiplano environment is harsh and organic materials preserve poorly. But stratigraphic analysis, studying the layers of soil and sediment, suggests that some of the circular formations predate the raised field systems by significant periods, potentially by millennia. If this dating is correct, it implies that circular basin construction on the Altiplano was not just contemporary with or derived from the raised field agricultural system but may have preceded it, may have been the earlier technological tradition that later populations adapted when they developed intensive agriculture in the region. The global pattern that emerges from examining these specific sites is suggestive but not conclusive. We see circular basin formations in multiple regions, often with evidence of human modification or enhancement, often dating to periods earlier than we would expect for sophisticated water management infrastructure, often showing characteristics, scale, precision, network connectivity that exceed what simple utilitarian water storage would require. But we also see enormous variation. The basins are not identical. The construction techniques differ across regions, as would be expected if these represent independent developments or if the knowledge spread and was adapted to local materials and conditions. The dates are imprecise and sometimes contradictory. The evidence of artificial modification is clear in some cases, ambiguous in others. This is the nature of investigating landscape-scale archaeology across vast time spans. The evidence is fragmentary. The preservation is uneven. The dating is uncertain. The distinction between natural and artificial is often blurred by millennia of erosion and modification. We work with probabilities rather than certainties, with suggestive patterns rather than definitive proof, with multiple competing hypotheses rather than single clear answers. What keeps the investigation alive, what prevents the circular basin mystery from being simply dismissed as overenthusiastic interpretation of natural features, is the cumulative weight of the evidence. No single site is definitive. No single piece of evidence is impossible to explain away. But collectively, the pattern is difficult to dismiss. The basins are too numerous, too geographically dispersed, too consistently circular, too often associated with clear evidence of human modification, too frequently linked by channel systems, too persistently referenced in ancient texts, to be comfortable explained as purely geological features that humans happen to occasionally use. The most parsimonious interpretation, the one that explains the most evidence with the fewest assumptions, is that circular basin engineering was a real ancient technology, practiced at various times in various regions, adapted to local conditions and capabilities, sometimes creating basins from scratch and sometimes enhancing natural features, representing a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and a willingness to invest in massive infrastructure projects whose benefits would extend across generations. This interpretation does not require lost supercivilizations or impossible ancient technologies. It requires acknowledging that Neolithic and early Bronze Age peoples had capabilities we have underestimated, that they could organize labor and plan long-term projects at scales we have not credited them with achieving, that their engineering knowledge was more sophisticated than the often fragmentary evidence in the archaeological record might suggest. It also requires accepting that much of this capability was lost, that the knowledge did not develop linearly toward our modern capabilities but was gained, practiced, lost, and sometimes regained over cycles of civilizational development and collapse. This is perhaps harder for modern minds to accept than simply dismissing the evidence. We are conditioned to see history as progressive, as moving steadily from less capable to more capable, from primitive to advanced. The idea that ancient peoples might have possessed sophisticated knowledge that was then lost, that we might be recovering or rediscovering rather than advancing beyond, challenges our sense of modern superiority. But the evidence for cyclical rather than purely progressive development is strong across many domains. Architectural techniques, metallurgical knowledge, mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, we find evidence that ancient peoples knew things that later peoples had to rediscover, sometimes taking centuries or millennia to recover knowledge that had been lost during periods of upheaval and social collapse. Why should hydrological engineering be different? Why should we assume that water management techniques developed linearly from simple to complex, rather than acknowledging that sophisticated techniques could have been developed, practiced, lost, and later redeveloped in different forms? The circular basin technology, if it was real, may represent a path not taken in later civilizations. An approach to water management that was effective in certain conditions but was abandoned as those conditions changed, as populations moved, as different agricultural and settlement patterns emerged that required different hydraulic solutions. As our investigation approaches its final considerations, we must address a question that has remained implicit throughout. What does it mean if we are right? What are the implications if the circular basins do represent sophisticated ancient engineering on the scale the evidence suggests? First, and most obviously, it would require revising our timelines for technological development. Sophisticated surveying, large-scale labor organization, advanced hydrological engineering, these capabilities would need to be pushed back thousands of years earlier than current models typically place them. This is not impossible. Archaeological discoveries regularly require such revisions. But the scale of the revision implied by the circular basin hypothesis is substantial, and it would have ripple effects across our understanding of multiple ancient cultures. Second, it would suggest that landscape-scale engineering was more central to early civilizations than we have recognized. We focus heavily on architecture, temples, pyramids, palaces, as the signature achievements of ancient civilizations. But if the circular basin networks are real, they represent engineering investments that dwarf the monumental architecture in terms of labor and resources. They suggest civilizations whose primary technological focus was not building upward but building outward, not creating monuments but transforming entire regions, not displaying power through vertical structures but through horizontal reshaping of the landscape itself. This shift in perspective matters for how we search for and interpret ancient sites. If we are primarily looking for monumental architecture, we miss landscape-scale engineering. If we assume that sophisticated civilizations must have left cities and temples and written records, we overlook populations whose technological achievements were primarily hydraulic and whose social organizations may have been more distributed, less centralized than the urban civilizations we know best. Third, it would validate taking ancient texts more literally in certain contexts. The references to ring seas and water circuits, to divine engineers and landscape-shaping ancestors, would shift from purely mythological to historically grounded, not literal in every detail, certainly, but preserving genuine memories of actual projects and capabilities. This would have implications for how we interpret other ancient texts that currently are dismissed as purely mythological. It would suggest that we need more nuanced approaches to distinguishing historical memory from pure invention in ancient narratives. Fourth, it would highlight the role of environmental change in driving both technological innovation and civilizational collapse. If the circular basin technology developed during wetter climatic periods and became obsolete as regions dried, it demonstrates how tightly linked ancient civilizations were to their environmental conditions, how dependent on maintaining specific hydrological balances. It serves as a warning about our own civilization's relationship with water resources and climate, about the fragility of infrastructure that depends on stable environmental conditions. But we must also consider the implications if we are wrong, if further investigation ultimately demonstrates that the circular basins are primarily natural features, that the evidence of human modification is minimal or later than we suspected, that the textual references are purely mythological rather than historical memory. What would that mean? Primarily, it would mean that human pattern recognition and our desire to find meaning in ambiguous evidence can lead us astray, that we must maintain rigorous skepticism even when patterns seem compelling, that extraordinary claims genuinely do require extraordinary evidence, and that we have not yet met that standard for the circular basin hypothesis. It would validate the mainstream archaeological caution about accepting claims that require significant revisions to establish timelines. It would demonstrate that the conventional approaches to dating and interpreting sites, while sometimes conservative, are conservative for good reasons, because alternative interpretations often prove incorrect when subjected to rigorous testing. But even if the specific circular basin hypothesis proves incorrect, the investigation itself has value. It has driven new surveys, new analyses, new thinking about landscape-scale archaeology. It has encouraged development of new tools and methods for distinguishing natural from artificial features in ancient landscapes. It has promoted interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, geologists, hydrologists, and other specialists. It has reminded us that the past still holds mysteries, that there are still questions worth investigating even if their answers remain uncertain. This is perhaps the most important point. The value of an investigation is not solely determined by whether it confirms or refutes a specific hypothesis. The process of rigorous investigation, of developing and testing hypotheses, of gathering and analyzing evidence, of refining interpretations in light of new data, this process itself advances knowledge even when the original hypothesis proves incorrect. So we continue to investigate. We survey additional sites. We apply new analytical techniques. We refine our dating methods. We conduct more thorough excavations at promising locations. We collaborate across disciplines and institutions. We remain open to evidence that supports or refutes the circular basin hypothesis, following that evidence wherever it leads rather than defending preconceived conclusions. This is the scientific approach to historical mysteries. Not certainty but investigation. Not faith in specific interpretations, but commitment to following evidence and logical reasoning. Not defensiveness about hypotheses, but willingness to revise understanding when revision is warranted by new information. The circular basins will continue to exist regardless of how we interpret them. The landscape holds its forms, patient and indifferent to our debates about their origins. The ancient texts continue to speak of ring seas and divine engineers, their words fixed on clay tablets and fragmentary papyri, waiting for interpretations that may never achieve certainty. The questions persist, may always persist, because the evidence is fragmentary and the time depths are vast, and the distinction between natural and artificial becomes increasingly difficult to determine as millennia of erosion blur the boundaries. But we persist too. We continue to question, to investigate, to analyze, to debate, because understanding our past matters. Because knowing what humans have accomplished in previous eras informs our sense of what is possible in our own era. Because every civilization stands on foundations laid by previous civilizations, and understanding those foundations helps us understand ourselves. The circular oceans, if they are oceans, if they are circular works of human engineering rather than natural features, represent a potential chapter in human history that has been largely forgotten. They suggest capabilities we have underestimated, ambitions we have not credited, achievements we have not recognized. They invite us to see the past as more sophisticated, more capable, more impressive than we might have assumed. Or they are natural features that have captured our imagination, patterns that we have overinterpreted, geological curiosities that we have mistaken for human accomplishment. They remind us of our tendency to find meaning where none exists, to see design in randomness, to create narratives that satisfy our desire for mystery and wonder even when simpler explanations are more probably correct. Perhaps the truth includes elements of both interpretations. Perhaps some basins are natural, some are enhanced natural features, some are entirely artificial. Perhaps the reality is more complex than either simple dismissal or enthusiastic acceptance allows. Perhaps, as is so often the case, the honest answer is we are not yet certain. But here is what we know and here is what remains to be discovered. Living with that uncertainty, maintaining investigation in the face of it, remaining curious and rigorous and open-minded even when answers prove elusive, this is what the circular basin mystery asks of us. Not belief, not dismissal, but engagement. Serious, thoughtful, evidence-based engagement with a question that may not have simple answers but is worth pursuing nonetheless. So we return to where we began, to the basic question: what are these circular formations in the desert, these near-perfect circles visible from satellites, these depressions connected by channels, these features that appear in ancient texts and modern surveys, that show both natural and artificial characteristics, that resist simple categorization. We do not know with certainty, but we know they are worth investigating. We know the question is legitimate, the evidence is suggestive, the implications are significant. We know that dismissing them as purely natural is as premature as accepting them as definitely artificial. We know that the investigation must continue, that more evidence must be gathered, that better analytical methods must be developed, that multiple competing hypotheses must be tested against the available data. And we know that regardless of the ultimate answer, the process of seeking that answer enriches our understanding of ancient landscapes, ancient capabilities, ancient civilizations. It pushes the boundaries of archaeological method, forces development of new techniques, promotes collaboration across disciplines. It keeps alive the sense of wonder and mystery that should always accompany our investigations of the deep past. The circular basins remain mysterious, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain partially unsolved, their questions more valuable than their answers, their invitation to investigation more important than any single interpretation. Perhaps the circular oceans serve us best not as monuments to proven ancient achievement nor as cautionary tales about overinterpretation, but as reminders that the past is still speaking, still revealing its secrets slowly, still inviting us to look closer, think deeper, question further. If you have journeyed this far, through all the evidence and speculation, through the technical discussions and the philosophical reflections, through the certainties and uncertainties alike, then you understand what this investigation has really been about. Not proving a specific theory, not convincing you of a particular interpretation, but inviting you into the process of serious questioning about the past. Demonstrating that mysteries remain, that evidence is complex, that investigation is valuable even when answers prove elusive. Perhaps you will carry forward some of what we have explored here. Perhaps you will look at landscapes differently, wondering what stories they hold beneath their surfaces. Perhaps you will read ancient texts with fresh eyes, considering the possibility that they preserve more literal truth than we have credited them with. Perhaps you will simply maintain a sense of humility about the past, acknowledging that our understanding is incomplete and that surprising discoveries may still await us in the fragmentary evidence of ancient civilizations. Whatever you carry forward, I thank you for your attention, your patience, your willingness to engage with questions that have no easy answers. The circular basins will continue to exist, continue to puzzle those who investigate them, continue to invite interpretations that range from dismissive to enthusiastic. The debate will continue, the investigation will continue, the slow accumulation of evidence will continue. And perhaps someday we will have answers that satisfy. But until then, we have questions. And questions, pursued with rigor and openness and intellectual honesty, are never wasted. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert air holds the coolness of night and the sand has not yet begun to radiate yesterday's captured heat, the circular basins show their forms most clearly. The low-angle sunlight creates shadows that trace their curves, highlights their subtle ridges, reveals textures that noon's harsh glare erases. This is when photographers and surveyors prefer to work, when the landscape offers up its secrets most readily, when the distinction between what is natural and what might be human-shaped becomes most visible. There is something profoundly moving about standing at the edge of one of these formations in that particular light. The scale becomes tangible in a way that satellite images cannot quite convey. The precision of the curve, maintained across distances measured in kilometers, becomes viscerally impressive when you can see it with your own eyes, when you can walk its perimeter and feel the consistency of its form beneath your feet. The channels that connect basins, visible only as faint depressions in the sand, become actual paths you can follow, tracing the ancient lines across the landscape. In these moments, the question of origin, natural or artificial, fades somewhat in importance compared to the simple fact of existence. These features are here. They shape the landscape. They influence how water flows during the rare rains. They determine where vegetation grows, where animals congregate, where humans have chosen to settle when they have settled in these regions. Whether they were carved by human hands or formed by geological process, they are now part of the story this landscape tells. part of its character and identity. But then the sun rises higher, the shadows shorten, and the analytical mind reasserts itself. The questions return. What made this? When was it made? How was it made? Why this form, this size, this location? The emotional response to beauty and scale gives way to the intellectual drive to understand, to categorize, to explain. This tension, between experiencing and analyzing, between appreciating mystery and seeking explanation, is perhaps at the heart of how we relate to ancient enigmas. We want both. We want to preserve the sense of wonder, the recognition that we are in the presence of something significant whose full meaning eludes us. But we also want to understand, to fit the mystery into frameworks of knowledge, to transform the unknown into the known. The circular basins, like all truly compelling mysteries, resist easy resolution of this tension. They offer enough evidence to make analysis possible but not enough to make conclusions certain. They are tangible enough to study but ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations. They invite investigation while withholding definitive answers. In this sense, they are perfect objects of inquiry for our age. We have extraordinary technological tools: satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis, computer modeling, LiDAR scanning, that allow us to examine ancient landscapes with unprecedented precision. But we also recognize the limits of these tools, the ways in which evidence can be interpreted in multiple valid ways, the impossibility of achieving absolute certainty about events separated from us by thousands of years and documented only through fragmentary remains. We can map the basins down to centimeter-scale accuracy, but we cannot definitively determine whether a specific curve is natural erosion or artificial shaping without excavation, and we cannot excavate more than tiny fractions of features that span square kilometers. We can analyze sediment cores and determine the chemical composition of ancient waters. But we cannot always distinguish between natural accumulation and managed filling and draining. We can translate ancient texts and identify references to water management. But we cannot always determine whether those references describe actual infrastructure or metaphorical concepts or some combination of both. So we work with probabilities, with preponderances of evidence, with interpretations that we hold tentatively, subject to revision as new data emerges. This is honest scholarship, acknowledging uncertainty while still advancing understanding, offering interpretations while recognizing their provisional nature, building knowledge incrementally rather than claiming revolutionary breakthroughs based on ambiguous evidence. The circular basin hypothesis, that these formations represent sophisticated ancient hydrological engineering, is currently in that uncertain space where evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, and that skepticism is methodologically appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for continent-spanning networks of engineered circular oceans, while intriguing, has not yet met the threshold of extraordinary. But skepticism should not preclude investigation. The hypothesis is testable. Specific predictions follow from it, predictions about where basins should be found, what characteristics they should have, what evidence of human modification should be present, what the sediment patterns should show, how they should relate to other archaeological sites. These predictions can be tested through targeted survey and excavation. The hypothesis can be supported, refined, or refuted through systematic investigation. This work is being done, slowly, by researchers who recognize that the questions are worth pursuing even without certainty of finding revolutionary answers. Some investigations have found evidence supporting human modification of specific basins. Others have found primarily natural explanations. The overall picture remains complex, with different sites showing different characteristics, resisting simple generalization. This is normal for landscape-scale archaeology dealing with features of great antiquity. The evidence is almost always mixed, the interpretations almost always debated, the conclusions almost always provisional. But knowledge advances nonetheless, incrementally, through the accumulation of carefully gathered data and the refinement of analytical methods and the testing of competing hypotheses against new evidence. The circular basins, whatever their ultimate origin, have already contributed to this advancement. They have driven development of new survey techniques, new approaches to distinguishing natural from artificial features in ancient landscapes, new collaborations between archaeologists and earth scientists. They have forced more careful thinking about what evidence is sufficient to support claims of ancient engineering, what characteristics reliably distinguish human-modified features from natural ones, how to date landscape-scale modifications that may not have convenient organic materials for radiocarbon analysis. In this sense, the investigation has been productive regardless of whether the specific hypothesis of engineered circular oceans proves correct. The questions have driven research that has expanded knowledge and refined methods. The mystery has generated insights that extend beyond the specific case of the basins themselves. The uncertainty has forced intellectual humility and rigor that improve how we approach other archaeological questions. And the sense of wonder remains. Standing at the edge of a vast circular depression in the desert, whether it was carved by ancient engineers or formed by geological process, we are confronted with scales of time and effort that humble the individual human perspective. If natural, these features represent processes operating over immense time spans, the patient work of geology that shapes landscapes across millennia. If artificial, they represent human ambition and capability at scales that challenge our assumptions about ancient limitations. Either way, they remind us that we are part of something much larger than our individual lives. Part of a planetary story that extends billions of years into the past. Part of a human story that extends tens of thousands of years into the past. Part of a civilizational story that has seen knowledge gained and lost, capabilities developed and forgotten, achievements accomplished and abandoned, across cycles of cultural fluorescence and collapse that span millennia. The circular basins speak to this larger context. They exist at the intersection of natural and human history, at the boundary between what landscapes do on their own and what they do in response to human intervention. They embody questions about memory and forgetting, about what survives from the past and how we recognize it, about the ways in which evidence can be simultaneously present and invisible depending on whether we know how to see it. These are not just archaeological questions. They are philosophical questions, questions about knowledge and interpretation and the relationship between observers and observed phenomena. They touch on fundamental issues about how we know what we think we know, how we distinguish signal from noise in complex evidence, how we balance skepticism with openness, how we hold interpretations while acknowledging their uncertainty. The circular basins, in this reading, become more than just potential ancient infrastructure. They become exercises in epistemology, in the theory of knowledge itself. They ask not just, what are these features? But, how can we know what these features are? Not just, did ancient peoples build them? But, what evidence would we need to be confident that ancient peoples built them? Not just, what was their purpose? But, how can we infer purpose from physical remains separated from us by vast time and cultural distance? These deeper questions are worth grappling with regardless of the specific answers we eventually reach about the basins themselves. They make us better investigators, more rigorous in our methods, more careful in our claims, more humble in our certainties. They force us to examine our own assumptions, to recognize how our expectations shape what we see, to develop more objective and systematic approaches to ambiguous evidence. And they keep us engaged with the past in ways that go beyond dry academic exercise. They maintain the sense that history is alive, that the past is not fully known, that mysteries remain to be investigated and potentially solved. They remind us that we are part of an ongoing human project of understanding, that each generation contributes its piece to the larger puzzle, that the work of recovering and interpreting the past is never finished. As we near the end of this extended exploration, it seems appropriate to reflect on what the circular ocean mystery represents in the broader context of how we understand ancient civilizations and human history. Beyond the specific question of whether these basins are natural or artificial, beyond the technical debates about evidence and interpretation, there are larger themes that this investigation illuminates. First, there is the theme of inheritance versus invention. Throughout this investigation, we have encountered evidence that ancient civilizations often saw themselves not as creators but as restorers, not as inventors but as inheritors of knowledge from predecessors. This perspective appears in the texts, in the traditions, in the way archaeological sites sometimes show evidence of populations using and maintaining infrastructure whose origins seem to predate their own cultures. This is profoundly different from the modern Western narrative of progress, which emphasizes innovation and advancement, which sees each generation building on the previous one's achievements through new discoveries and inventions. The ancient narrative is more cyclical. Knowledge exists, is lost, is recovered, is lost again. Civilizations rise, accomplish great things, collapse, and later civilizations sort through their ruins trying to understand what came before. Both narratives are probably partially true. Human history shows both progressive development and cyclical patterns. Technologies are invented, refined, sometimes lost, sometimes rediscovered. Knowledge accumulates but also fragments and disappears. The challenge is holding both patterns in mind simultaneously, recognizing that history is neither simply progressive nor simply cyclical but incorporates elements of both. The circular basins, if they represent ancient engineering that was later lost and forgotten, would be examples of the cyclical pattern. Knowledge of sophisticated landscape-scale hydrological engineering existed, was practiced, produced impressive infrastructure, and then was lost as environmental conditions changed, populations moved, and different technologies became more relevant to new circumstances. Later peoples inherited the infrastructure without fully inheriting the knowledge that created it, used it where possible, maintained it where practical, but could not recreate it at the original scale. This pattern has parallels in many domains. The knowledge of creating Damascus steel was lost. The techniques for producing Roman concrete that self-heals and strengthens over centuries were lost. The methods for creating certain ancient dyes, glazes, metallurgical alloys, architectural acoustics, all were lost at various points and had to be either rediscovered or replaced with different technologies. The circular ocean engineering, if it was real, would simply be another example of this recurring pattern of lost knowledge. Second, there is the theme of landscape as text. Throughout this investigation, we have been attempting to read the landscape, to interpret the features carved into earth and stone as if they were written records that could yield information about the past. This is landscape archaeology at its most ambitious, treating the shapes of the land itself as evidence of human activity, as potential messages from the past about what was built and why. But landscapes are difficult texts to read. They are palimpsests, written over repeatedly by geological processes, climate changes, and successive human modifications. They lack the clear syntax of written language, the obvious markers that distinguish signal from noise. They require interpretation that is always somewhat uncertain, always subject to multiple valid readings. Yet they are also remarkably durable texts. Stone and earth persist across time spans that destroy most other forms of evidence. Massive earthworks can survive for millennia, long after all other traces of the cultures that created them have vanished. In some cases, landscape features may be the only evidence we have of ancient activities, the only text that survived when everything else was lost. Learning to read this text, to distinguish natural from artificial features, to recognize patterns that reveal human intention, to extract meaningful information from ambiguous evidence, is one of the crucial challenges of archaeology. The circular basin investigation is advancing this skill, developing new methods and approaches that will be applicable to other landscape-scale archaeological questions beyond the specific case of these formations. Third, there is the theme of water and civilization. Throughout human history, water management has been absolutely central to the development of complex societies. Every major early civilization arose in relationship to water sources and developed sophisticated methods for controlling and distributing water. Irrigation systems, aqueducts, reservoirs, canals, wells, canets, terracing, drainage networks, the technologies vary, but the imperative is universal. Control water and you can support large populations, agricultural surpluses, urban settlements, specialized crafts, centralized governments, all the characteristics we associate with civilization. The circular basins, if they are artificial, represent an approach to water management that is different in scale but not in kind from what we know other ancient civilizations accomplished. They would be larger, more ambitious, perhaps more sophisticated in their integration across regions. But they would be addressing the same fundamental challenge. How do we ensure reliable water supplies in environments where water availability is uncertain, seasonal, or insufficient for the populations we wish to support? Understanding ancient water management is not just an archaeological curiosity. It has contemporary relevance. We face our own water challenges. growing populations, changing climate patterns, depletion of aquifers, conflicts over river systems, the need for massive infrastructure investments to ensure water security. The ancient approaches, the technologies they developed, the organizational methods they used, the mistakes they made, all of this is potentially instructive for our own situation. If the circular basin technology was real, if it represented successful large-scale water management that sustained populations for extended periods before environmental changes made it obsolete, then understanding how it worked, why it eventually failed, what lessons can be drawn from both its successes and its ultimate abandonment, these would be valuable insights. Even if the technology itself is not directly applicable to modern conditions, the principles underlying it, the approaches to thinking about regional water management, the methods for organizing massive long-term infrastructure projects, these could inform contemporary efforts. Fourth, there is the theme of humility before the past. One of the most valuable outcomes of investigations like this is the reminder that ancient peoples were not primitive, not intellectually inferior, not limited to simple technologies and simple social organizations. They were as intelligent as we are. They had thousands of years to develop sophisticated knowledge and capabilities. They accomplished things that still impress us, that we still struggle to fully understand or replicate. Maintaining this humility, recognizing that we do not have all the answers, that the past may still hold surprises, that our understanding is incomplete and subject to revision, is crucial for honest historical investigation. It prevents us from dismissing evidence simply because it challenges our assumptions, keeps us open to new discoveries, new interpretations, new understandings that might require revising what we thought we knew. The circular basin mystery embodies this need for humility. Whether these features are ultimately proven to be artificial or natural, the investigation has revealed how much we do not know about ancient landscapes, ancient capabilities, ancient civilizations. It has exposed gaps in our knowledge, limitations in our methods, assumptions that may need to be questioned. It has reminded us that the past is not fully understood, that mysteries remain, that there is still work to be done. And finally, there is the theme of wonder. Throughout this investigation, alongside the technical analysis and the careful evaluation of evidence, there has been a sense of wonder at the scale, the ambition, the sheer audacity of what might have been attempted. Whether these basins are natural or artificial, they are impressive. They command attention. They invite contemplation. They spark imagination about what was possible, what might have been achieved, what secrets the landscape might still hold. This sense of wonder is not antithetical to rigorous investigation. It is what drives investigation. It is what keeps researchers working on difficult questions without clear answers, what motivates the development of new methods and approaches, what sustains curiosity across years or decades of patient evidence gathering. Wonder without rigor becomes mere speculation, but rigor without wonder becomes dry cataloging, losing the animating curiosity that makes investigation meaningful. The circular basins exemplify this combination of wonder and rigor. They are wonderful in the literal sense of being full of wonder, of inspiring awe and curiosity and the desire to understand. But they also demand rigor, careful analysis, systematic investigation, honest evaluation of evidence, willingness to accept conclusions even when they disappoint initial hopes or expectations. Balancing wonder and rigor is perhaps the key to successful investigation of ancient mysteries. Too much wonder leads to accepting extraordinary claims based on insufficient evidence. Too much rigor leads to dismissing intriguing possibilities without adequate investigation. The balance, maintaining wonder while insisting on rigorous evidence, pursuing questions with curiosity while maintaining methodological standards, is what allows us to investigate productively, to advance understanding without straying into unfounded speculation. The circular basins have taught us this balance, or reminded us of it if we already understood it. They have shown us how to maintain serious investigation of questions whose answers remain uncertain. They have demonstrated that it is possible to take seriously the possibility of extraordinary ancient achievement while also maintaining appropriate skepticism, to investigate rigorously while preserving the sense of wonder that makes investigation worthwhile. As we conclude this exploration, the basins remain in the desert, weathering slowly under sun and wind, holding their shapes against the erosion of time, waiting for us to understand them fully. The questions remain open. The investigation continues. the mystery persists. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Not frustrating but appropriate. A reminder that the past is vast and complex and not fully knowable. That there are always more questions to ask, more evidence to gather, more understanding to develop. What, then, are we to make of the civilization that might have built circular oceans? If the evidence eventually supports the hypothesis of sophisticated ancient hydrological engineering at the scale these landscape features suggest, what does that tell us about the people who conceived and executed such projects? They would have been, first and foremost, practical. Visionary, certainly, to conceive of reshaping landscapes at such scale. Ambitious, absolutely, to attempt projects that would consume generations. But fundamentally practical, addressing real needs for water management with engineering solutions that, however impressive in scale, served utilitarian purposes of water storage, distribution, and agricultural support. They would have possessed sophisticated knowledge of multiple domains, surveying and geometry to lay out circular formations with precision across kilometers, hydrology to understand water flow and storage requirements, geology to select appropriate sites and materials, engineering to design structures that could withstand the pressures of holding vast quantities of water, administration to organize labor forces across extended periods, agriculture to plan for the use of the water resources being created. This is not the knowledge profile of primitive peoples slowly developing basic technologies. This is the knowledge profile of a sophisticated civilization operating at levels of capability we normally associate with much later historical periods. If the circular basin engineering dates to the periods that the limited archaeological evidence suggests, Middle Holocene or earlier in some cases, then we are facing evidence of capabilities existing thousands of years before the civilizations we normally think of as the earliest sophisticated cultures. How do we reconcile this with the archaeological record? How do we explain evidence of sophisticated engineering without corresponding evidence of cities, writing systems, monumental architecture, and all the other markers we typically use to identify complex civilizations? Perhaps our markers are wrong. Perhaps we have been looking for the wrong kinds of evidence, expecting ancient sophistication to express itself in forms similar to the civilizations we know best, urban, literate, building in stone, leaving rich material cultures that preserve well in the archaeological record. But what if there were civilizations that expressed their sophistication differently? That built primarily in earth rather than stone? That were more distributed rather than concentrated in urban centers? That developed sophisticated knowledge traditions that were transmitted orally rather than through writing? That invested their resources in landscape modification rather than monumental architecture? Such civilizations would leave different archaeological signatures. Fewer artifacts, since distributed populations living in earth structures leave less material evidence than concentrated urban populations living in stone buildings. Fewer texts if writing was not developed or was used less extensively. Fewer monumental structures to attract attention and excavation. But potentially massive earthworks. Modifications to the landscape itself that would persist long after all other evidence had vanished. This is speculative, admittedly, but it is speculation grounded in the evidence we have, the landscape features themselves, the ancient texts describing ring seas and water circuits, the limited archaeological evidence of sophisticated activity in regions and periods where we do not find the traditional markers of complex civilization. It is an attempt to construct a framework that explains the evidence without dismissing it as coincidence or overinterpretation. If such civilizations existed, if the Ring Sea people or their predecessors were real cultures with sophisticated capabilities that have left primarily landscape-scale evidence, then they represent a chapter of human history that has been largely invisible to traditional archaeology. Not because the evidence does not exist, but because we have not been looking for evidence in this form, in these places, at these scales. Recovering this history, if it exists, will require new approaches. Systematic landscape archaeology using satellite imagery and ground-based survey to identify and catalog circular and other geometric features that might represent ancient engineering. Careful excavation at selected sites to look for evidence of human modification and to date the construction or enhancement of features. Analysis of sediment patterns to distinguish managed water systems from natural lake deposits. Collaboration between archaeologists, geologists, hydrologists, and other specialists to develop comprehensive understandings of how these features formed and how they functioned. This work is beginning, The circular basin hypothesis, while still controversial, has generated enough interest that investigation is proceeding at multiple sites across multiple regions. Some of this work will likely support the hypothesis, finding clear evidence of human engineering. Some will likely refute it, demonstrating that specific features are primarily natural. The overall picture will emerge gradually, as individual studies accumulate and patterns become clearer. But regardless of the specific outcome, the investigation itself is valuable. It is expanding how we think about ancient civilizations and what forms they might have taken. It is developing new methods for landscape-scale archaeology. It is taking seriously the possibility that sophisticated capabilities existed earlier and in different forms than we have traditionally recognized. It is approaching ancient texts with more nuanced interpretation, looking for historical kernels within mythological narratives. And it is maintaining wonder. In an age when we sometimes feel that everything worth discovering has been discovered, when the map of the past seems mostly filled in, the circular basin mystery reminds us that significant questions remain open, that there are still potential discoveries that could reshape our understanding of human history, that the past has not yielded all its secrets, that mysteries persist, that investigation remains not just possible but necessary. If the civilization that built circular oceans existed, they left behind works of such scale that they have become part of the landscape itself, indistinguishable to casual observation from natural features, visible only to those who know how to see them. They created infrastructure that may have functioned for millennia, that shaped how water flowed across regions, that supported populations whose full extent and achievements we are only beginning to glimpse. Or they did not exist, except as a hypothesis that has driven valuable investigation, and the circular basins are natural features that have captured our imagination and inspired us to develop better methods for distinguishing natural from artificial in ancient landscapes. Either way, the mystery has served its purpose. It has made us question, investigate, analyze, debate. It has advanced knowledge and refined methods. It has reminded us of humility before the past and maintained our sense of wonder at ancient achievements. It has demonstrated that serious investigation of challenging questions is worthwhile even when answers remain uncertain. The circular basins remain in the desert, their forms slowly eroding but still recognizable, still visible from satellites, still inviting interpretation. They will continue to exist long after we have finished debating their origins, long after the current generation of investigators has given way to the next. They are patient in the way that landscapes are patient, indifferent to our theories, simply existing as they are, holding their shapes across centuries and millennia. Perhaps someday we will know with certainty what they are, how they formed, whether they were carved by human hands or shaped by geological process. Perhaps the investigation will reach conclusions that satisfy skeptics and proponents alike, that explain the evidence comprehensively, that close the questions we have been exploring. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they will remain mysterious, evidence insufficient for certainty, interpretation forever debated, the questions we have been asking continuing to be asked by future generations with better tools and different perspectives but still without definitive answers. Both outcomes are acceptable. Knowledge is valuable, certainty is desirable, but the process of honest investigation is valuable even when it does not yield the certainty we might prefer. The questions themselves, rigorously pursued, advance understanding even when final answers remain elusive. And so we leave the circular basins to the desert, to time, to future investigators who will bring their own tools and perspectives to these enduring mysteries. We have asked our questions, examined our evidence, offered our interpretations. We have tried to balance wonder with rigor, speculation with skepticism, openness to extraordinary possibilities with insistence on adequate proof. The investigation will continue beyond this exploration. Other researchers, other investigations, other evidence yet to be discovered. The story is not finished, may never be finished, because history is not something that is completed but something that is continuously reinterpreted as new evidence emerges and new perspectives develop. If you have traveled this far through the investigation, through all the evidence and speculation, through the technical details and the philosophical reflections, then you have been part of this process. Not as passive receiver of information but as active participant in the investigation, weighing evidence, considering interpretations, forming your own conclusions about what these mysterious circular formations might represent. Perhaps you are convinced that they represent ancient engineering of extraordinary sophistication. Perhaps you remain skeptical, seeing primarily natural features with modest human enhancement. Perhaps, like the investigators themselves, you find yourself in the uncertain middle ground, recognizing intriguing patterns while withholding definitive judgment pending further evidence. All of these positions are reasonable given the evidence we currently have. The virtue is not in reaching specific conclusions but in engaging seriously with the questions, in considering the evidence carefully, in maintaining both openness and skepticism, in recognizing that our understanding of the past is incomplete and subject to revision. The civilization that might have built circular oceans, if it existed, is lost to us in most respects. We do not know their names, their languages, their stories, their beliefs. We have perhaps only their greatest works, massive earthworks carved into the landscape itself, and fragmentary references in the traditions of later peoples who knew them only as mysterious predecessors, as ring sea people, as the ones who came before. But if they existed, they were human, as intelligent as we are, as capable of sophisticated thought and ambitious projects, as driven by needs and desires and visions of what might be possible, as subject to the constraints of environment and technology and social organization. As mortal, their works outlasting them, their knowledge vulnerable to the forgetting that time imposes on all human achievements. In this, they are not different from us. We too build works we hope will outlast us. We too develop knowledge we hope will be preserved and transmitted to future generations. We too wonder what will be remembered, what will be forgotten, what traces of our civilization will remain when thousands of years have passed and peoples we cannot imagine are trying to understand what we accomplished and why. The circular basins, whatever their origin, remind us of this continuity. They are part of the long human story, whether as achievements of past civilizations or as natural features that have inspired human imagination across millennia. They connect us to that story, remind us that we are part of something much larger and longer than our individual lives, invite us to wonder about those who came before and those who will come after. And in the end, perhaps that is the deepest value of investigating mysteries like this. Not the specific conclusions we reach about whether these features are natural or artificial, not the details of ancient engineering or geological process, but the connection they create across time, the sense of participating in an ongoing human project of understanding, of trying to know what came before so that we might better understand who we are and what we might yet become. The circular oceans, real or imagined, serve this purpose. They have drawn us into deep time, into questions about ancient capabilities and forgotten knowledge, into the mystery of what survives and what is lost. They have made us think about memory and forgetting, about evidence and interpretation, about certainty and uncertainty. They have invited us to wonder, to question, to investigate, to engage seriously with a past that refuses to surrender all its secrets. And perhaps, in the final analysis, that is exactly what such mysteries are meant to do. Not to be solved quickly or easily, but to draw us deeper into the investigation, deeper into the past, deeper into the questions that make us human. Questions about where we came from, what we are capable of, what we might have forgotten, what we might yet discover about the long and winding journey that brought us to this moment in time. The circular basins remain. The questions remain. And we remain, curious and questioning, seeking understanding in the fragmentary evidence of ages long past, building knowledge incrementally, maintaining wonder while insisting on rigor, honoring both the achievements we can definitively document and the mysteries that persist beyond our current ability to resolve. Thank you for wandering through these questions with me, for allowing the mystery to remain mysterious while still taking it seriously, for engaging with evidence that is complex and ambiguous and resistant to simple answers, for recognizing that some of the most valuable investigations are those that challenge our assumptions, expand our sense of what is possible, and remind us that the past is still speaking if we know how to listen. If this exploration has sparked something in you, curiosity about other ancient mysteries, questions about what else might remain undiscovered, a different way of looking at landscapes and ancient texts, then perhaps you will continue the investigation in your own way. Perhaps you will seek out more information, visit some of these sites if opportunity allows, engage with the ongoing archaeological and geological debates, Add your own voice to the conversation about what these features represent and what they tell us about human history. And if you have found value in this deep exploration, if the slow unfolding of this mystery has resonated with you, perhaps you will share it, not to convince others of specific conclusions, but to invite them into the questions, to spark their curiosity, to demonstrate that history is not a closed book but an ongoing investigation full of unanswered questions and surprising possibilities. Consider this an invitation, not aggressive, not demanding, but gentle and genuine, to continue this conversation. To leave your thoughts in the comments below, sharing what aspects of this investigation intrigued you most, what questions it raised for you, what interpretations you find most compelling. The value of investigating mysteries like this multiplies when we engage collectively, when different perspectives and insights combine to create understanding that no single investigator could achieve alone. And if this kind of exploration speaks to you, if you appreciate the approach of taking ancient mysteries seriously while maintaining intellectual rigor, of combining wonder with careful analysis, of pursuing questions across 20,000 words because the questions deserve that depth of attention, then perhaps you will join me for future investigations. Subscribe if you wish to continue this journey together, exploring other mysteries that hide in plain sight, other questions that challenge our understanding of human history, other stories that the past is trying to tell us if we learn how to listen. But only if it genuinely resonates with you. Only if you feel, as I do, that these questions matter, that the past deserves our serious attention, that there is value in dwelling within mystery rather than rushing past it toward comfortable certainty. Only if you understand that the deepest truths often emerge not from quick answers but from patient investigation, from willingness to sit with uncertainty, from maintaining curiosity even when, especially when, answers prove elusive. The circular oceans await us still, out in the desert silence, under skies that have watched them for millennia. They are patient. They will be there tomorrow, next year, next century, slowly eroding but still recognizable, still holding their secrets, still inviting those with eyes to see and minds to question. Perhaps we will understand them fully someday. Perhaps we will decode their origins with certainty, settling the debate between natural and artificial, between geological accident and human achievement. Perhaps new technologies, new methods, new discoveries will provide the definitive evidence that has so far remained just beyond our grasp. Or perhaps they will remain forever partially mysterious, their full story lost to the depths of time, knowable only through fragments and educated guesses and interpretations that remain forever subject to revision. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to endure, their questions more valuable than any single answer could be, their invitation to investigation more important than arriving at conclusions. Either way, we have asked the questions. We have examined the evidence. We have considered the possibilities with seriousness and rigor and appropriate wonder. We have honored both the achievements we can document and the mysteries that resist documentation. We have maintained the balance between skepticism and openness, between demanding evidence and remaining curious about what that evidence might reveal. And in doing so, we have participated in something essential to being human, the drive to understand, to question, to investigate, to connect with those who came before us by studying what they left behind. Whether the circular basins were carved by ancient engineers or shaped by geological process, they have served this purpose. They have drawn us into deep time, into serious questioning, into the productive uncertainty that drives genuine investigation. The desert wind moves across them still, carrying dust and memory, whistling through channels that may or may not have been carved by human intention, filling and emptying the basins with the patient rhythm of geological time. The stars will overhead as they have wheeled for millennia, watched by peoples we can barely imagine, whose languages we may never hear, whose stories we can only glimpse through the fragmentary evidence they left behind. And we watch too, we who come so late to this ancient landscape, trying to read what the earth remembers, trying to hear what the silence is whispering, trying to understand what the circular forms carved into continents might tell us about who we are and what we are capable of and what we might have forgotten in the long journey from then to now. The investigation continues. The questions persist. The mystery endures. And we endure with it, questioners in a universe that does not easily surrender its secrets, investigators in a past that reveals itself slowly and incompletely, humans trying to understand the human story by studying the marks we have made upon the world. Thank you for being part of this investigation. for your patience with the slow unfolding, for your engagement with complex evidence, for your willingness to dwell within uncertainty. The circular oceans, whatever they are, however they came to be, have brought us together in shared wondering, and that itself is valuable, that itself is part of the long human tradition of gathering to share stories about what might have been, what might still be discovered, what the past might yet reveal to those who look closely enough and question deeply enough and care enough to keep investigating even when answers remain elusive. The basins remain in the desert. The mystery remains open, and the invitation remains to continue questioning, investigating, wondering about the extraordinary things that humans might have accomplished in ages we can barely glimpse, and about the extraordinary landscapes that nature creates, and about the often blurred boundary between the two, where human intention and natural process intertwine in ways that make simple categorization impossible. Rest well with these questions. Let them turn in your mind as you drift toward sleep, if that is where this exploration finds you. Let them remind you that the world is stranger and more complex than we often acknowledge, that history holds secrets we have not yet decoded, that the past is not fully known and may never be fully known, and that there is profound value in that uncertainty, in the humility it requires, in the curiosity it sustains, in the investigation it invites. The civilization that built circular oceans, if it existed, is silent now. But the silence is not empty. It is full of questions, full of possibilities, full of invitations to look closer, think deeper, question further. And in responding to those invitations, in taking seriously what might seem dismissible, in maintaining both rigor and wonder, we honor not just the possible achievements of the past but the essential human drive to understand, to know, to connect across the vast distances of time with those who came before and those who will come after. Sleep well if sleep is your destination. Dream of circular seas and ancient engineers, of landscapes that remember what we have forgotten, of knowledge that persists in forms we are only beginning to recognize. And wake to continue the investigation, in whatever form that takes for you, whether as active researcher, engaged reader, curious questioner, or simply as someone who now looks at landscapes differently, who sees mystery where before there was only geology, who asks questions where before there were only assumptions. The circular oceans remain, waiting. The past remains, partially accessible. The mystery remains, inviting. And we remain, questioners and investigators, carrying forward the long human tradition of trying to understand what came before, what might yet be discovered, what the earth itself might be trying to tell us if we learn its language. Thank you. Question deeply. Wonder constantly. And remember that the most valuable investigations are often those whose conclusions remain uncertain, but whose questions change how we see the world. In the mathematics of mystery, there is an equation we rarely acknowledge. Understanding multiplied by uncertainty equals engagement. The circular basins exemplify this formula perfectly. We understand enough to recognize their significance, to frame coherent questions, to design meaningful investigations. But we remain uncertain enough that the questions stay alive, that the investigation remains necessary, that engagement continues across years and decades and potentially centuries of inquiry. This is not failure. This is the natural state of investigating the deep past, where evidence is fragmentary, where time has erased more than it has preserved, where the distance between question and answer is measured not in experimental iterations but in patient accumulation of data across generations of researchers, each contributing their piece to a puzzle that may never be entirely completed. The circular basins have entered that rare category of archaeological mysteries that are substantial enough to warrant serious investigation but ambiguous enough to resist quick resolution. They are not speculative fringe theories based on misinterpreted or fabricated evidence. The features exist, documented in satellite imagery, mapped in geological surveys, visible to anyone who chooses to look. But neither are they so obviously artificial that their human origin is undeniable. They occupy the productive middle ground where genuine uncertainty drives genuine investigation. This is where knowledge grows most vigorously, not in the realm of the already known or the obviously false, but in the uncertain territory where multiple interpretations remain plausible, where evidence could support different conclusions, where investigation is both necessary and challenging. The circular basins are fertile ground for this kind of growth, generating new methods, new collaborations, new perspectives that extend beyond the specific question of their origin to influence how we approach other landscape-scale archaeological problems. Consider what we have learned through this investigation, regardless of whether the basins ultimately prove to be artificial or natural. We have learned to see landscapes differently, to recognize that the largest human achievements might not be buildings or monuments but modifications to the land itself. We have learned to take ancient texts more seriously as potential historical sources rather than dismissing them automatically as pure mythology. We have learned to question our assumptions about ancient capabilities, to recognize that sophisticated knowledge and engineering could have existed in forms and periods different from what we expected. We have learned humility, acknowledging how much we do not know about the past, how fragmentary our evidence is, how provisional our understanding must remain. We have learned to balance skepticism with openness, maintaining rigorous standards of evidence while remaining curious about possibilities that challenge established models. We have learned that investigation itself is valuable even when it does not yield the revolutionary discoveries we might hope for, that the process of careful inquiry advances knowledge incrementally even when dramatic breakthroughs remain elusive. These are not trivial lessons. They shape how we approach not just the circular basin mystery but all investigations of the ancient past. They make us better investigators, more thoughtful interpreters of evidence, more aware of our own biases and assumptions, more capable of sitting with uncertainty while still pursuing understanding. And they connect us to something larger than our individual inquiries. We are part of a long tradition of humans trying to understand human history, trying to recover what has been lost, trying to honor the achievements of those who came before by taking seriously what they accomplished and what they tried to preserve in texts and traditions and the physical modifications they made to the world. This tradition extends backward through centuries of historical scholarship, through millennia of oral tradition preserving memories across generations, through the entire span of human self-awareness and curiosity about our own origins. And it extends forward to future investigators who will bring new tools and new perspectives to these enduring questions, who will potentially solve mysteries that remain opaque to us, who will look back at our investigations with the mixture of appreciation and amusement that we direct toward earlier generations of scholars working with more limited evidence and methods. We are links in a chain of inquiry, each generation contributing what it can, none possessing complete understanding, all participating in the slow collective project of recovering and interpreting the human past. The circular basins are one thread in this larger tapestry, one set of questions among countless others, one mystery that connects us to both the distant past we are trying to understand and the distant future that will continue the investigation after we are gone. This perspective, seeing ourselves as temporary participants in an ongoing project larger than our individual lives, brings both humility and meaning. Humility because we recognize that we do not and cannot have all the answers, that our understanding is limited and provisional, that future investigators will likely see things we miss and know things we cannot access. Meaning because we are contributing to something that extends beyond ourselves, something that matters not just for our own curiosity but for the collective human project of self-understanding. The circular basins, in this expanded view, are not just archaeological features to be classified and dated. They are touchstones for reflection on human capability, human ambition, human relationship with landscape and water and time. They are prompts for philosophical consideration of what survives and what is lost, what we can know and what must remain uncertain, how we balance the desire for answers with the recognition that some questions may remain forever partially resolved. They are also, in a very practical sense, laboratories for developing new investigative methods. The challenge of distinguishing natural from artificial features in ancient landscapes at scales too large for conventional excavation, the problem of dating modifications that may not include organic materials suitable for radiocarbon analysis, the difficulty of interpreting sediment patterns that could reflect either managed or natural water systems. These are methodological challenges that drive innovation. Solutions developed for investigating circular basins will be applicable to other landscape-scale archaeological questions, will advance the broader field even if the specific case of the basins remains debated. This is how science progresses, not always through definitive answers to the questions that initially drove investigation, but through the development of better questions, better methods, better frameworks for understanding that emerge from grappling with difficult problems. The circular basins are serving this function admirably, generating investigation that advances knowledge even while the core question of origin remains unresolved. And they are serving another function, perhaps equally important, maintaining public engagement with archaeology and ancient history. In an age when the past can seem remote and irrelevant, when immediate concerns dominate attention, mysteries like the circular basins remind us that history is not dead but alive with questions, not fully known but still revealing its secrets, not boring but fascinating to those willing to look closely. This public engagement matters. It matters for supporting the research that investigates these questions, research that requires funding, institutional backing, public interest. It matters for maintaining cultural memory and historical consciousness, for keeping alive the sense that we are part of a long story that extends deep into the past and far into the future. It matters for inspiring the next generation of investigators who will carry forward the inquiry after current researchers have finished their work. The circular basins, whether they ultimately prove to be monuments to lost civilizations or merely interesting geological features that have captured human imagination, are fulfilling this role. They are drawing attention to questions about the ancient past, sparking curiosity, inviting engagement with archaeological and historical investigation. They are making visible the process of inquiry itself, how evidence is gathered, how hypotheses are formed and tested, how uncertainty is navigated, how understanding develops incrementally through collective effort. This visibility into the investigative process is valuable. Too often, scientific and historical knowledge is presented as finished product rather than ongoing process, as certain conclusions rather than provisional understanding subject to revision. The circular basin investigation, precisely because it remains unresolved, precisely because uncertainty persists, demonstrates the reality of how knowledge is actually created. Messily, uncertainly, through debate and revision and gradual accumulation of evidence that slowly tips the balance of probability in one direction or another. Seeing this process, understanding that knowledge is constructed rather than simply discovered, that uncertainty is normal rather than exceptional, that serious investigators can disagree while all maintaining rigorous standards, this is educational in ways that extend far beyond the specific question of circular basins. It models intellectual humility, evidence-based reasoning, comfort with uncertainty, and commitment to following evidence wherever it leads rather than defending predetermined conclusions. These are valuable intellectual virtues for any domain, not just archaeology and ancient history. They are ways of thinking that serve us well in navigating a complex world where evidence is often ambiguous, where multiple perspectives exist, where certainty is rare and humility is appropriate. The circular basins, as a case study in how to investigate uncertain questions rigorously, teach these virtues by example. So we return, as we must, to the fundamental question: what are these circular formations in the desert? And we answer, as we must, with honesty: we are not yet certain. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The investigation continues. The debate persists. Multiple interpretations remain plausible. And that is acceptable, not as a permanent state, but as the current state, subject to revision as new evidence emerges and new analyses are conducted. We do not need to pretend certainty we do not possess. We do not need to force conclusions from insufficient evidence. We can maintain the investigation in the productive space of uncertainty, pursuing questions rigorously while acknowledging that answers may take decades or longer to emerge with confidence, if they emerge at all. The circular basins will remain in the desert regardless of how long our investigation takes. They have persisted for millennia. They can persist through however many more years or centuries we require to understand them fully. They are patient in the way that stone and earth are patient, indifferent to our timelines, simply existing as they are, holding their forms against the slow erosion of wind and rain and time. And we will continue to investigate, bringing whatever tools and methods we develop to bear on the question of their origin and purpose. Some investigations will support artificial origin, finding clear evidence of human modification. Others will support natural origin, demonstrating geological processes sufficient to explain the features. The overall understanding will emerge gradually from the accumulation of these individual studies, from the patterns that become visible when multiple sites are examined with consistent methods, from the slow consensus that forms when evidence persistently points in particular directions. This is not dramatic. It is not the stuff of documentary revelations or breakthrough discoveries announced in press conferences. It is the patient, methodical, sometimes tedious work of serious investigation. Survey, excavation, analysis, publication, debate, refinement, gradual accumulation of knowledge. But it is how real understanding is built, how genuine questions are answered, how we move from uncertainty toward greater confidence, even if perfect certainty remains elusive. The circular basins deserve this patient, serious investigation. They deserve researchers who bring both rigor and openness, who maintain high standards of evidence while remaining curious about what that evidence might reveal, who are willing to have their hypotheses refuted if that is where the evidence leads, who are equally willing to defend surprising conclusions if the evidence supports them. And they deserve our continued attention, not obsessive focus that elevates them beyond their legitimate significance, but the steady curiosity that keeps investigation alive, that maintains funding and institutional support, that ensures the questions continue to be asked and evidence continues to be gathered and understanding continues to advance. If you have read this far, through all 16 parts of this exploration, through 20,000 words examining these mysterious formations from every angle we could access, then you understand that this has been about more than just circular basins. It has been about how we investigate the past, how we balance wonder and rigor, how we maintain curiosity in the face of uncertainty, how we contribute to the long collective project of understanding human history. The circular basins have been our case study, our example, our touchstone for exploring these larger themes. But the lessons extend beyond them to every investigation of the ancient past, to every attempt to recover what has been lost, to every effort to honor those who came before by taking seriously what they accomplished and what they tried to preserve for future generations. Thank you for this journey, for your patience with the slow unfolding, for your engagement with complex questions that resist simple answers, for your willingness to dwell in uncertainty while still taking the investigation seriously. The circular basins remain mysterious, and perhaps they will remain so for some time yet. But we have asked good questions about them. We have examined the evidence carefully. We have maintained both wonder and rigor. And in doing so, we have participated in something essential to being human, the drive to understand, to question, to investigate, to connect across time with those who came before and those who will come after. The investigation continues beyond this exploration. Other researchers, other sites, other evidence yet to be discovered. And you are now part of that investigation, whether as active researcher or engaged reader or simply as someone who now sees landscapes differently and asks different questions about the past. The circular oceans, real or imagined, have changed how we see. And perhaps that is their greatest gift, not answers but better questions. Not certainty but deeper engagement with mystery. Not conclusions but invitations to continue investigating, continue wondering, continue participating in the long human project of trying to understand where we came from, what we are capable of, and what stories the past is still trying to tell us if we learn how to listen.